signed. Committee Room 30, 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 signed. Committee Room 30. 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 Signed. Committee Room 30, 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 Committee Room 30, signed. 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 Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound.
Thank you. Okay, so welcome, and just would like to remind members that this will be broadcast online and throughout Parliament buildings, and to welcome those who's in the public gallery and watching online. So if you can ensure your phones are muted, and a reminder that no recording or photography is allowed in the meeting. So if members are content, we'll proceed with the agenda. Okay, so we haven't any apologies for today. Do we have any declarations of interest? No. Okay, so in terms of Chair's business, I haven't any in particular. I just want to note that I attended the annual statement from the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission this week. It was very good. I'm sure we'll get to some of the detail in that today. Your draft minutes are found in your pack, pages 7 to 14, and if you're content, I'll go ahead and sign these. Great, okay. Any matters arising? I just have the one, and that's just to advise you, maybe a lot of you will have seen, that the Secretary of State made a statement last week to begin the process of formally repealing the Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Act 2023. Just a reminder that we, as a committee, have written to the Secretary of State asking for the detail of how the Act will be repealed. Okay, members? Okay, so we're going to move into our first session then in terms of taking oral evidence in relation to the inquiry into gaps in equality legislation, if you'd like to come forward. So, members, page 17 in your pack, you'll find the Clerk's brief. Page 19, you'll find the Human Rights Commission's oral response to the inquiry. And on page 3 of the table pack, you will find the notes from the Christian Institute following the committee's event last week up in the Long Gallery. So just on that point, the Assembly Research Service is in the process of writing up the notes from that, and
we've just received those.
Oh right, okay, okay, so that's good. Okay, so welcome to the meeting. So we've got Alison Kilpatrick, who's the Chief Commissioner, Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. We also Dr. Colin Cohey, is that correct? Director of Policy, and Dr. Claire McCann, also of the Commission. So thank you so much for attending. Busy with you up and down the road to the Parliament buildings, but really appreciate your time today and your efforts in terms of providing us with the brief. If you'd just like to go ahead and make some opening remarks. Thank you very much, Alison.
It's always nice to be here.
Thank you.
So thank you for another opportunity to address this committee. We welcome this review because we think it will reinvigorate the debate on equality law reform for Northern Ireland. We specifically welcome the committee's focus on recommendations from international treaty bodies. The Commission published its annual statement on human rights Monday, I've already lost track, which includes a chapter on equality and non-discrimination. We have said in that, and we repeat again today, the principle of equality is central to understanding human rights. Article 14 of the European Convention, which has been incorporated into UK law by way of the Human Rights Act, provides that, and I will read this out if I may, it's quite
Please.
short. The enjoyment of the rights and freedoms set forth in the Convention shall be secured without discrimination on any grounds such as sex, race, colour, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, association with the national minority, property, birth or other status, and other status has been interpreted by the court as being broad. At the international level, the rights of equality tends to be defined in very open-textured terms, and the central international human rights covenants simply refer to an obligation on states to ensure human rights without distinction, discrimination, exclusion or restriction, or on the basis of equality as between men and women. But that has been elaborated since. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has made clear that international human rights requires transformative equality in society, culture, politics and the economy. UK Government and Northern Ireland Executive should, ensure the adoption of comprehensive anti-discrimination and equality legislation containing a clear definition of discrimination, which comprises direct, indirect, structural forms of discrimination, covering all fields of law in public and private domains and all prohibited grounds of discrimination in accordance with the relevant treaties. A single Equality Act for Northern Ireland that ensures intersectional multiple discrimination claims in Northern Ireland, ensures that they are addressed, is required, and we'll, I suspect, go on and say a little bit more about that in detail. So whilst there is legislation in Northern Ireland prohibiting age discrimination, this is one of the differences, in the area of employment and occupation, further and higher education and vocational training, there is no specific equality legislation prohibiting discrimination in provision of goods, facilities and services in Northern Ireland based on age, where there is such in GB. Therefore, equality legislation should be extended, we recommend, to the protection in the provision of goods, facilities and services to all children under 18 years old. Age discrimination, of course, applies at both ends of the age bracket. The Commission encourages the Committee to consider not only what law reforms are required, but how their implementation can be supported. And as you've said yourselves before, it's often in the implementation that it's most critical. Committee members know that equality is also central to the no diminution commitment in Windsor Framework. And this is largely a standstill obligation linked to relevant EU law as it stood on 31st of December 2020. It covers only that EU law which underpins the rights, safeguards and equality of opportunity part of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. In September, the Northern Ireland Court of Appeal confirmed the relevant part of the agreement contains a broad suite of rights. The Commission, along with colleagues in the Equality Commission, have identified a number of EU measures which underpin these rights, and that's set out in various bits of advice. There is also an obligation for Northern Ireland law to dynamically align with changes, in other words, keep pace with changes which amend or replace the 6 equality directives listed in Annex 1, where these changes strengthen rights. We have highlighted in our submission recently adopted EU measures which will require Northern Ireland law to be amended to reflect these changes. And we could discuss this today or on another occasion, but for example, the Pay Transparency Directive. The obligation to keep pace with the 6 equality directives in Annex 1 means case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union is relevant in interpreting. It's therefore essential that the Executive and other NI departments monitor these case law developments for updates on how directives are to be interpreted, and that's also a task we have and we continue. To assist the process, the Equality Commission, on behalf of ourselves and the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, have commissioned research to track EU developments in the area of human rights and equality. Our first report was 2022, and last month we updated and published a new report. Highlights key case law of relevance to those equality directives. And one, for example, is the Court of Justice of the EU held that definition of disability discrimination in the Framework Equality Directive, which is one of the ones specifically listed in Annex 1, should include discrimination between persons with disabilities. Therefore, Northern Ireland law must be interpreted in line with that decision. And if one thinks about it for any length of time, you can see exactly why it should be interpreted in that way, but between persons with disabilities. So outside of the 6 core equality directives, in Annex 1 there is no obligation for Northern Ireland law to track EU developments. However, there is potential for equality and human rights on the island of Ireland to diverge following UK withdrawal. Prior to 31st December 2020, EU law had facilitated the alignment of many laws on rights and equality between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and is set out in more detail in that written submission. We take the view that long-term North-South equivalence of rights was envisaged by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. It's important for the enjoyment of rights on a cross-border basis and in terms of access to the island of Ireland and cross-border services such as health is a very obvious one. It also supports North-South cooperation in line with Article 11 of the Windsor Framework. And just to end, there is also the possibility, of course, even if not required under Windsor Framework, that the Northern Ireland Executive can voluntarily ensure NI law aligns with changes to EU equality and human rights law, where the changes strengthen rights and reflect international human rights standard. that's a very quick, and I spoke very quickly to try and get through it. It's a very quick overview of what it set out much more comprehensively in briefings and advices we've published. We'll do our very best to answer the questions today. I know we are again short of time, but we can elaborate on or address other things that I haven't touched on.
Okay, thank you, Alison. Are either of your colleagues going to speak at it? No? Okay. Well, thank you so much again. I just wanted to pick up on the issue around the keep pace potential there. You mentioned it there in terms of the recommendation to the Executive Office pursuant to Articles 2 and 13 of the Windsor Framework to bring forward legislation to amend Northern Ireland law to ensure it keeps pace with those provisions of EU directives on standards for equality bodies. Could you sort of speak to how difficult or how intense it would be to do that, or would that actually be quite a simplistic, straightforward process?
I won't have to do it. I think it would be relatively straightforward. But I wonder if Claire McCann, who's our everything post-Brexit and dedicated mechanism expert, wants to, do you want to say something about that?
I will say, first of all, that our colleagues in the Equality Commission are leading on this work, so they're probably best placed to advise on the specificities of it. What the equality body standards do is they just create improved protections, improved strength and protections for equality bodies in Northern Ireland, including the Equality Commission. So given that they do amend all 6 of the Annex 1 equality directives, there is that obligation under the Windsor Framework to update Northern Ireland law to reflect that. We haven't done an analysis as yet on a clause-by-clause basis of what that would require, but I understand that colleagues in the Equality Commission are working on that, and we will share that as soon as we can.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's also, it might be worth adding that as far as other countries are concerned, we actually fare pretty well in terms of the standards equality bodies are held to.
Okay, thank you. So you talked about transformative equality, and I suppose we are looking at the gaps, but we're also trying to pick up those areas that have fallen furthest behind in some ways, and probably our go-to in Northern Ireland is the Section 75, the protected characteristics. Are there any sections of society that you think that could really benefit from us prioritising efforts to update the law? Please.
Children.
First
of all, I would say, given that they aren't specifically protected other than through in employment and education, LGBTI community, they're not a homogenous community, but there are identifiable issues that are unprotected in Northern Ireland which have received greater protection in GB. I would say women still, when violence against women and girls is at such an epidemic level, even that they're equal in a lot of other respects, they are not in relation to criminal justice response to violence. There is also in relation to gender and women's health, which, and I understand there was some work done on a women's health strategy. So that would be to bring up, to write into provision the need to reach equality of outcome as well as access. I think other than that, though, it's really about, and disabled people, I'm afraid, across Europe do not have the protection they deserve, but that's not necessarily, and none of these things are necessarily an absence of law. It's an absence of application of law, or maybe even just a mindset of the community, where I think we would say that if you get that mindset right, that every single person is equal, not the same. So to make them equal, some people need more of something, and maybe less of another thing, and there's nothing unequal about that. So you try to bring everybody up to the same level. And once you start looking at it like that, and you look at the person in front of you and what it is that they need to be equal, then I think you can probably expose all sorts of groups and individuals who are not yet equal, but as a sort of as a group of people compared to other places, it would be that would be my answer. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just one of our specific recommendations is around the incorporation of protections in relation to intersectional discrimination, which in a way would resolve that question of what specific group, if there's protection for intersectional discrimination, then it will address individuals, the majority of us who have multiple identities and are members of multiple groups. And I think just further highlighting Alison's answer, we highlighted in our submission the absence of numerous strategies in relation to those specific groups. And really, without those strategies being developed and being put in place, it's hindering the ability to see where law reform is required and where simply more effective policies and procedures are required to ensure that individuals are able to enjoy their rights on an equal basis with others.
We encountered that last week in terms of minority language rights, in terms of their strategies as well. So it's certainly something that we don't, that those sit under Department for Communities, but we certainly recognise the issue. Actually, I was going to come on to the intersectionality point as my last question for bringing Deputy Chair. So when we had the stakeholders event up in the Long Gallery last week, we found, because I sort of roved between the tables, found very similar issues regardless whether it's disability, religious groups, and that was really about people's everyday people's understanding of their rights and where they should be treated equal or where they're not being treated equally. How would that manifest in terms of a presentation that you feel wider society could grasp and understand?
There's an awful lot more work to do on education and promotion and just understanding, I think, what human rights are about. There has been such a counter-narrative to human rights across the globe, it's not particular to here, that I think people genuinely feel that their rights are not protected because they've been told they're not protected, or they've been told they've been singled out and have got less of something because somebody else has got human rights. And I think finding a way to explain and really sort of reach people in the lives they're living at the minute. So how rights apply in relation to housing, how they apply in relation to access to health, countering some of the myths. It doesn't sound easy, but it's easier for me to say that than to actually do it. Yeah. One of the difficulties the Commission has had over the last, certainly I can only speak to when I've been there, is that we just haven't had a budget to do the promotion and education work. We do go out to schools and engage with children across schools, with businesses and human rights, with sports, but so much more needs to be done, and it takes a lot in the initial stages to convert what is can be legal and dry and into something that people really get and understand. And I think it does more harm than good if we just sit there and read out treaty provisions to them. We've got to be able to translate it into how it affects people, and also put our hands up at times that it's not perfect out there yet. By no means is it perfect yet. I know the Westminster government are very keen at the minute on the promotion agenda, and they've asked us about it and how we can feed into that. So we have had an internal review and an independent review, which I think has recognised that we need more money for that side of work. Claire wanted to say something about discrimination. Do you want to say it now? Or?
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on the intersectionality point that Colin raised. I'm sure committee members are aware, but obviously under that keeping pace obligation pursuant to Windsor Framework Article 2, the Pay Transparency Directive specifically mentions intersectionality, so Northern Ireland law will need to update to reflect that requirement by the transposition deadline of June 2026. And it's a specific legal requirement that derives from that.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, please, Stuart. Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for that and for the information that we provided with in the committee. A number of sort of questions and areas. Firstly, there's been a lot of discussion and talk, both from political parties and also from key players like yourselves, in the provision of single equality legislation for Northern Ireland, drawing together all those disparate pieces of equality legislation and then being able to build on all of that. Where are we in respect of developing that, and what input have you had to help the Executive Office in building that bill?
The Equality Commission is leading on that. However, there is obviously within the European Convention the non-discrimination provision, which is an umbrella provision for all equality, we would say. So we look at it in respect of everything we do. We haven't been asked to advise specifically. We have made recommendations that certainly the provision of real equality would be assisted by having one piece of legislation, because at the minute it's fragmented, it's very complicated. I don't know how anyone gets anyone who's not a lawyer, and even a lot of lawyers who can't get their head around it. So that would be accessible to the public. They would know what their rights are, and it would also give an opportunity to really bring it together. And I think it would be helpful for decision makers and leaders to really understand as well what it is, how all these bits work together. And you could update in relation to age discrimination, things like that. But other than recommending, we agree with the Equality Commission, with their recommendations there, they sort of take the lead on.
In terms of our requirement to keep pace, bearing in mind the glacial speed of the Executive Office to do anything, how confident are you that we will actually be able to keep pace?
I think it will depend on whether there's a will to, firstly. I'm not as concerned about the pace of the Legislative Assembly as I am about the will, perhaps, to identify what needs to be kept pace with. And that's not pejorative towards anyone in particular, any party in particular, just that there is an awful lot coming out of the EU. We have a department which is routinely scanning and trying to keep on top of what it is that this means and what needs to be done. We have identified on many occasions, however, that there isn't proper attention being paid to Windsor Framework Article 2 in any policy or legislation. So it really somebody needs to sit down on any piece of policy that's being developed or legislation, think, what does this mean in relation to Windsor Framework Article 2, but also they need to be keeping on top of the EU provisions. And we have very good relation with the EU, in that they do tend to notify us, don't they, of stuff. Maybe not as much as we'd hope, but I think it's partly just being on top of it. What is it? What has to be included? We would love to do more.
Is that a resource issue as well? I mean, is that a consequence of Brexit, in the sense that when we were inside the EU, then the national government was basically translating, transposing and delivering all of that for the whole of the United Kingdom? And is it, while on the one hand I would hold some criticism at the speed of the Executive Office, at the same time it is unfair and unreasonable on them to keep track of all of that without an adequate resource? Yeah,
I think it's quite a challenge for them. I have a degree of sympathy, and also obviously when we were part of the EU, a lot of it didn't have to be transposed; it was directly effective. So there is definitely a resource implication.
Okay.
You talked perhaps because Claire works directly in this area.
Yeah, just to add to that, just to say that we are mindful of the fact that there is a huge amount of work involved with tracking with what's going on. We have, as Alison has mentioned in her opening remarks, our colleagues Nisi and I have led in this work, but on behalf of ourselves and the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission published 2 pieces of research now which is tracking some of that divergence between Northern Ireland and what EU standards are coming down the track, and it does continue to identify those measures, and we will be undertaking further research to identify further kind of developments in this area. But it is a huge area of work. Having said that, a lot of these areas were devolved areas, would have required Northern Ireland to transpose them into Northern Ireland law. That said, this is an obligation on the UK government, so our avenue is obviously to speak to you here in this committee and to other members of the Assembly and other ministers to talk about the importance of giving effect to these obligations within our legal framework. But we will also be communicating these obligations to the UK government, to the Secretary of State as relevant as well. It's not just on this committee, it's not just on the executive. We are making these same arguments to the UK government too.
It is important that just because the United Kingdom has left the EU, that it doesn't turn its face away from or doesn't recognise those responsibilities which it has, and those have to be adequately resourced. You also made reference to, in one of the areas where perhaps we started to fall behind, is in respect of issues specifically around women. And it's interesting today there's a House of Commons report on misogyny in medical services for women. To what extent do you believe that affects us here in Northern Ireland? It's certainly an area of question which I intend to put to the Department of Health, but it is an important area and it's one that needs to be tackled. Have you any comment on that?
I'm going to let Colin say something about an attempt we've made to actually carry out research and look into this more carefully, but it's surprising the difference, actually the divergence in protection between men and women in relation to health, and it stems back for centuries, but there's an awful lot of the health system is based around men and men's bodies, even just shape, size, weight. vaccinations, all sorts of things, and it's never really been addressed. And there is a danger sometimes when we talk about this that people say, but if you believe in equality, then men and women are both human beings, they've both got the same organs, they don't need any special treatment. But that's exactly what's not happened. So we've got to a stage where we have to redress that. And Colin, I'll let you say what's happening with our research.
Yeah, we're looking into the issue of women's health, and I've been engaging with the Department of Health in terms of plans there for women's health strategy, or plans not to develop a women's health strategy, and keen really to explore how our system needs to be reformed and developed to ensure that it's meeting the needs of women's health. So we can update the committee. I'm not familiar with the report that was out today, but happy to review that and come back specifically on it if that's fine.
And do we currently have a women's health strategy?
No.
And I think this is what essentially the baseline is what the House of Commons are saying today in this report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Brian, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your attendance today and your paper. I want to explore the potential consequences of some of what you're calling for, and what safeguards or mitigations you would recognise or not recognise as being applicable. In terms of 2.11, provision of goods, facilities and services, we've heard quite a lot from older people's groups about that issue. You're also highlighting of that for children under 18 years of age. Obviously some goods are not permitted for children, alcohol, tobacco, and there's also need to protect children from some influences, and they may have their own views on that. Recently the Education Minister raised the issue of mobile phones during school class time, but also issues pornography, gambling, things available on the internet. What would you recognise as recognition of things that are either illegal or undesirable for children to have access to?
Well, illegal is easily dealt with because if it's illegal for me, it's illegal for a child.
But some are only illegal for under 18. Obviously.
Yes. Well, they're only illegal to provide to a child, I think. I'm not sure the child would necessarily face criminal conviction for buying cigarettes, for example, but I don't know. I'd need to ask a criminal lawyer exactly about that. But the point is that there are limits to all of our freedoms, and society has decided that certain things are dangerous for a person under 18 in a different way to those who are over 18, or at the very least that somebody who's over 18 can take a calculated risk themselves. So you do have to balance a lot of these things. There isn't, I'm not going to pretend there's an easy answer to some of this stuff. And in fact, we were having a philosophical debate about it earlier. Who gets to decide exactly at what age? But the point is that you start off from the basis that all things being equal, everyone is entitled not to be discriminated against in the provision of goods, services, unless there is an objective justification, which is proportionate. And in the case of cigarettes, alcohol, etc., that's a proportionate interference with a child's right.
Well, I could see there could be a whole range of issues where there would be debates, about what is permitted. But you would recognise where the law applies, obviously.
No, completely. And I mean, so much of this is politics, which is not for us. Mm-hmm. We accept that the legislator gets to have these debates and democracy gets to decide often where the balance has to be struck. Mm-hmm. And so long as it's lawful, necessary, proportionate, etc., you can limit rights. My rights right now are probably limited to some extent in what I go out and do after I leave here. Mm-hmm. Similarly with children.
Yep. Okay. Likewise, 213, it's very much a topic of public debate around gender identity, and you're saying about to better protect those who experience discrimination in relation to sexual orientation or gender identity. Again, what is the position of the Commission on female-only protected spaces within society, including the whole issue of sport, which has become very much a topic, but also protected spaces, prisons, certain care settings, and also female-only groups, some schools, if it's girls-only schools, and then youth organisation, girl guides, etc., and likewise boys-only organisations. There's
a whole range of different ways you could look at, depending on which one of those things you're talking about. Of course, the law now says if somebody has a gender recognition certificate, they are treated for all purposes as the gender recognised on that certificate. So a trans woman would be entitled to access a woman's space. In terms of prison, there are all sorts of risk assessments carried out in relation to who is put together in any one cell or in any one wing of a prison. For example, a white nationalist could be a woman, could be a danger to a Muslim woman in a cell with her. So these are things that other people are better equipped to decide on. But in terms of, if what you're really asking is what is gender, what's sex, and is it determined at birth or not, that's not something we have a position on as such. We follow the European standards, and it's not as clear as I wish it was, because I wish somebody else would tell us where the lines are in relation to all of these things. But certainly it's unlawful to discriminate against somebody. That doesn't mean, as I said earlier, everyone gets treated exactly the same. So you can have restrictions. Sport is difficult because particularly because most people turn to elite sport, which is very different to just kids doing PE together at school, or even adults playing sport at university or at work. And I think with elite sport, it's more difficult. And again, there is a lot of medical evidence which is developing. There's a lot of guidance which is changing. I don't know the answer. It's the short thing. We don't have I wish I had. I wish I could tell you what the actual black and white answer is, but I can't.
No, I'm not denying the complexity of the issue. The problem is when things become legislation without mitigation. Again, it's the consequences of that, whether intended or unintended. And I will always personally want to stand up that there is a need for female-only spaces, within society, and for good reason.
It's a balancing exercise. What we talk about there is discrimination in relation to sexual orientation or gender identity, and nobody would say that anyone has a right to discriminate against anybody else for whatever that reason. So how you define discrimination is what is really important there. As I say, not everybody should be treated exactly the same. That doesn't mean they're discriminated against. Yeah,
but I know it was a national lottery. I don't know if it's still the case. I know when the funding first came out, and groups who were single gender groups, found they were being excluded because you couldn't have a group that was only providing for boys or just providing for girls. I'm not sure what the up-to-date situation. Just one more.
No, not for a second. Am I going to pretend this is easy?
Yeah. One other, Chair, and as a general point, recognition for the religious values of churches and other faith-based groups. Do you recognise when something is a faith-based value that again there needs to be recognition of that within legislation? For example, if churches have a position on same-sex marriage, that they shouldn't be persecuted, or prosecuted.
No, I wouldn't even try to argue against. You would not persecute somebody with a faith-based objection to something.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Timothy,
it's how we define persecution. But
prosecution more defined.
Once you go into the actual application of it, it gets a lot more.
But you would have recognition.
Oh no, absolutely. As does the European Convention, it recognises there's a freestanding right in the Convention to express your religion. And it's written into, so for example, the right to education, the child's right to education. There is also a right to the parent to have the child educated according to their religious ethos. But again, it goes back to a balancing, and a parent doesn't have a right to deny a child of all education. And it's where society, politicians like yourselves get to decide often where that balance is. But I absolutely agree. A person, an ability to express your faith is absolutely core to somebody's belief. I wouldn't seek to argue otherwise.
Thank you. Go ahead, Tim, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much for coming today and providing the pack. It's been very useful, and it's the information you have provided that I want to touch base on a couple of points on. Page 30, which is page 12 of your pack, 212. In June 2023, the UNCRC committee noted that it remained concerned about persistent discrimination against children in disadvantaged situations, including lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender children. How or at what age can a child identify in your eyes as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or even be classed as straight?
Well, thankfully it's not for my eyes to determine that at all. It's for others, and that recommendation hasn't really got anything to do with that. It's to do with protection against bullying and harassment and discrimination. And as I said previously, that's not something anyone would condone against a child for whatever reason. You're asking much more philosophical, maybe even medical questions that I'm not equipped to answer. So I don't have my personal belief isn't really here nor there. And at the Commission, I don't have the luxury really of acting on my personal belief or convictions. I look at what the European standards are. And this is simply what the UNCRC committee noted.
I certainly would be interested to build on what you have in your pack, to understand what age they believe that a child can classify as gay, straight, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, because I think that goes to the heart of this. And it seems to be that there's those that want to sexualise children at a young age. The age of consent is 16. So why make this an issue for children under 16?
I'm not sure they're talking about children under 16 in particular.
That's the age of consent. So a child, once you pass 16, you'll be classed as a young adult. And when they're talking about children, they're obviously talking about children under the age of 16.
Talking about up to 18? They define child as up to the age of 18?
Yeah, but that could be anybody. That could be somebody in
Well, it could
primary
be anybody
school.
up to the age of 18. It couldn't be anybody else.
Yeah, but that's where my concern, and having that in your briefing paper, that's certainly something that concerns me.
Well, just in relation to it being in the paper, that is simply a factual situation. That is what the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child Committee said, and the recommendation it made. It's not making a recommendation at what age you accept the capacity of a child to identify or tell you what it is they're feeling. So that's, there is evolving capacity. And the issue about whether or not you can decide whether you're gay or not, that's a whole other debate that I'm not going to have today, because that's not for me. I think, but a person who is gay, if they're under the age of 18, the UNCRC committee is saying that they have been subjected to bullying and harassment, etc., and shouldn't be, and that's what that recommendation is about.
Yeah, and then just going on to that in 213, so the Commission recommends that the Equality Framework is amended to better protect those who experience discrimination in relation to their sexual orientation and/or gender identity. But surely discrimination is already illegal. So what do you want to see? What further protections do you want to see put in place?
Discrimination is not illegal. So this is discrimination. So if I discriminate against somebody on the grounds of them being gay, that's not illegal at the minute. So it depends what you mean by illegal. Do you mean criminal, or
Be classed as if you went against somebody because of their sexuality, that you can't take that into consideration.
Well, it's only very recently the law actually came up to date and protected specifically people from discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity, but it's not illegal to do so. You may face a consequence for your action, but as would I if I cruel to a dog, I will face a consequence of my action. That's all that is. So the law around discrimination is that if you discriminate against somebody, then you will face a consequence for your action, not yet criminal consequence, unless you fall into, unless you're doing something which is also criminal. So if you assault somebody,
216, the Commission recommends that institutional mechanisms are required to ensure the enforcement of equality law, in particular those relating to gender equality. Do you recognise that there's a conflict between female rights and those, like yourselves, calling for action on so-called gender identity?
Not as, no, I wouldn't put it as bluntly as that. There is a big grey area in the middle, and I confessed I don't know the answer to that, to all the situations that arise in that big grey area in the middle. But I do not feel, having analysed the objective standards and what discrimination is prevented and what discrimination isn't, that pitches women, as you are describing them, against others. I don't think they are in competition with each other at all. And what we're talking about is discrimination. As I say, there is an area which is still, people much bigger brains than mine are still trying to work out in that area in between what we do about it. But there can never be a reason to discriminate against somebody, and that's what we're talking about.
Surely the starting point is that, a woman going into a woman's toilets, that possession, if she, needs to be protected, that it is women only.
Well,
there's no grey area in that. Somebody needs to feel safe. If somebody is a woman going into a woman's toilets, they need to be
I wish I could
safe.
I wish I could say women are uniquely safe. It doesn't mean you're safe just because it is a woman's only toilet. And there are lots of men who aren't trying to take advantage of female clothing, if I can put it that way, if that's the sort of person you're talking about, who could access that sort of space.
My concerns would more be that a transgender man thinks he has the right to go into a woman's only toilet.
Well, a person who would have a right to go into a women's only toilet would be a trans woman with a gender recognition certificate, because they are a woman for all purposes. That's the law, and it has been for a very long time. So I'm not meddling with the law. That's simply what the law says. Whether or not you think trans women are more dangerous, I would disagree with you. The research is not that's the case, but there are other people, I say, better than me looking at all of this, what the consequence of this is. But I do think more needs to be done in relation to violence of men against women, and less maybe focus on trans women, which is a very, very small proportion of society. And
sorry, Tim, that's 5 questions. I'll bring you in if we've got time at
This
the end.
time I thought we were going by.
I think if I could just, if there is one important thing I would like to say, just in case I haven't made this clear, trans women are not dangerous. There's no evidence that trans women are dangerous. There's no evidence that they're a threat to anybody, and a trans woman's recognition certificate is a woman. It's as simple as that. That's the law.
Okay, thank you. Sinead, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And as it's Human Rights Week, can I congratulate the work that you and your team do in the Commission? And I was at the statement on Monday, and it was thoroughly, it's so heartening to see just the depth and the scope of the work that is going on within the Commission. Thank you for that. In relation to the papers that you have presented us with today, you have suggested that institutional mechanisms are required to ensure the enforcement of equality law related to gender equality. Can you give me a wee bit more detail around what those possible institutional mechanisms could be or might be, and what would you think about the suggestion of possibly a gender equality commissioner or a women's commissioner, and how that might support the whole issue of gender equality?
I think I'm going to let Colin respond to this, but all I would say is where you have an inequality, you really do need focus, at least in the first few years, a focal point, and an institution that is monitoring and looking at whether or not the grand ideas of equality are being met in practice. And you need people specifically set up to do that. But Colin's going to talk about the actual institutions we would envisage.
Yeah, so our recommendation there is drawing on the 1995 Beijing Platform for Action that considered this issue of how women's rights can be placed much more so on the policy priorities of governments throughout the world. And with that Platform for Action, there was a move for institutions within government with a specific focus on the promotion of gender equality for women. So we were highlighting there just the importance. Obviously, you have our own institution and the Equality Commission, who are independent of government and monitoring their performance, and in our case reporting on to the international human rights system. But within government, we're very much keen to see that there's a focus there, particularly in Northern Ireland. Joined up government can be a particular challenge, so ensuring you have a mechanism within government that can coordinate the response and deal with any blockages in departments to bring change about. So in the UK government, there's the Gender Equalities Office that would very much take on that role, and I think there's a need to consider in the machinery of government we have here in Northern Ireland, who has those specific responsibilities whenever it comes to equality for women, and possibly need to refresh. I should say that the violence against women strategy we very much see as, if not the gold standard, very close to it in terms of how strategy should operate, and actions within then, if they are implemented, we see it as real potential to affect change. Essential to that is effective working across government, and we hope to see that and then have something that we can model on to develop other strategies.
The ending of violence against women and girls is something that we need to see action in and around. And you've suggested as well that the TEO analyses the EU directive on combating women against violence. How does the TEO, for example, inform the work of other departments, and in this instance would be the Department for Justice, for example?
I'm going to ask Claire to respond to that one.
I mean, the role between the Executive Office and the Department of Justice, I will leave for yourselves to work out. In terms of what I suppose the Combating Violence Against Women and Girls Directive does, might be where I'm best able to speak to. It essentially updates some of the victims' directives at an EU level, so it's not part of our keeping pace obligation, or it may be. There's an area where it may overlap, but it generally is part of this kind of wider risk of divergence with EU standards. But essentially, what it does is it updates EU standards on victims' rights to reflect largely the Istanbul Convention, which is the Council of Europe Convention on Violence Against Women and Girls, and takes it into EU law. So in terms of that, it just sets a model for how that can be transposed into law, which we think is useful. Where it does perhaps engage that keeping pace obligation is in relation to the role of equality bodies and the specific provisions that it has in relation to criminalisation of sexual harassment in the workplace, for example, given that sexual harassment in the workplace is something that falls within the Annex 1 directive on gender equality in employment. So it sets out a kind of a comprehensive suite of protections in this area, which is a useful model, I suppose, rather than something we're saying that needs to come into Northern Ireland directly, but could be useful for consideration in developing of standards in domestic law.
Colin wanted to add something.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, just in terms of how government departments here work together, we've established a treaty working group that includes the different Northern Ireland departments that have responsibilities for international treaties. So through that forum, we hope that the department officials with those international reporting responsibilities are able to share their experiences and look at how, for instance, the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women and the other treaties, how they come together and how you coordinate action across government to ensure that Northern Ireland is meeting its international human rights obligations.
Okay. Keeping on the gender inequalities, for example, we had an announcement or statement from the Minister of Health on Tuesday in relation to a 3-year plan for transformation, but stabilising transformation and reform, and that it was a hefty enough and quite ambitious programme. It obviously requires a lot of funding in order for it to be more than a statement, should we say. But it was remarkable that women's health wasn't mentioned as an area for reform, and there's a great deal of inequality in women's health. We've had a report out from the Southern Trust today looking at medical negligence in relation to cervical smear testing and that, and women have died as a result of it, and it's not an isolated incident. There was reports yesterday that it's in other trusts, the Belfast Trust, the Western Trust. I met a few constituents the other day. Terrible consequences. So that's I'm back to the Equality Commissioner and the role that a gender commissioner or a women's commissioner would be vital for pulling all of this together and to just make sure that we use every institutional mechanism that we can to tackle the widening gaps. And I just don't get a sense even that, whilst the TEO is leading on, for example, the violence against women and girls, the collective of government needs to work with it at pace. And that's kind of like what I'm looking for in terms of the mechanisms where you can have maybe an annual report or something like that tells you where you are and what inroads you've made. What's your thoughts on that?
I think even just recognising that there's an issue is a really good place to start. And until recently, I'm not sure we even recognised there was an issue, or at least the extent of the issue within health, or do in relation to other things. Mm-hmm. How you do that institutionally, I think probably asking the wrong person, because I think I would be inclined to have commissioner for all sorts of things, but only if they're actually given something real to do and they have some power and they work closely with government who have to make the final decisions. And it would also enable, so there are men's health issues as well which need to be addressed. So men have some health issues which aren't being addressed because we have maybe a preoccupation with gender neutrality, which is the same thing as saying equality is treating everybody the same. It's not. Mm-hmm. So some things are quite gendered for men and for women. So recognising that there can be a difference in having people specifically educated, trained and knowing what to do with those gender specific things, I think is really important. And if it started off with a commissioner, that commissioner could then presumably, by consulting with the community and people who know better than I do, could start to make recommendations about what institution you need. But you would start off with the experts in that field to then advise you, I think, on the institutions.
Can I ask another question? You've also suggested in the paper that there's been no clear indication yet from the Department for the Economy on whether it will ensure the relevant protections in relation to equal pay, that it will keep pace as well. I know there's a good jobs bill out at the moment for consultation, but what precisely would you advise the Minister for the Economy to do in order to correct this? And do you have an assessment on whether the appropriate, again, and back into the departmental structures are in place to make sure that we monitor, the status of equal pay and its developments?
My slightly simplistic answer to that would be, if everyone's doing what they're supposed to do. Claire will have a much more sophisticated answer probably. Is there something we can say at this stage on that?
I'm just going to reiterate that this is one that we've identified as falling within that keeping pace obligation. It is a compliance issue. It is something that needs to happen by June 2026. We issued a briefing, our colleagues in the Equality Commission led on this, I think back in August, could have been September, where it set out a clause by clause analysis of what the Pay Transparency Directive requires in terms of Northern Ireland law to keep pace, and why we think it's it's clause by clause, it's every provision and where we think law needs to change to be updated to reflect that. The Good Jobs, as I like to call it, employment rights consultation, didn't address this issue specifically, recognise that there are new regulations or a consultation on new regulations coming forward, also hasn't specifically dealt with this issue. So I think it would just be emphasising again that this is a legal requirement and is something that needs to be actioned fairly quickly in order for it to be implemented in Northern Ireland law by that deadline of June 2026.
And maybe it's not specific there because they are going to be compliant about it, so it didn't have to go into the bill. But I'm just like, it wasn't there, and it's just important that we.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move on. Carol, please.
Thank you. There's been a number of areas that you've identified that certainly need. We need to keep pace. So you've got racial equality, you've got gender equality, you've got as Sinead has raised, pay, and then the disability discrimination as well. Is it just too naive to think that, as well as trying to keep pace, that this is another example or another argument for the need for a single equality bill? And an absence of that, and an absence of agreement before June 2026. What will happen if there is no agreement? Because we've had disability, gender, race, other strategies blocked before. So just in legal terms, you know, what will this mean for citizens here?
The Single Equality Act brings everything together.
It does.
And treats, and essentially in its own, in the text of the Act, treats everyone equally, not the same, so it does distinguish and explain all of that. But at the minute, if you have something for a disabled person, that's sort of separating them out already. And they are also a worker, they are also maybe a woman, they're also maybe somebody of colour. So their equality has to be met but all those reasons. So it makes no sense to me that all these different groups would be provided for separately. So if you have a Single Equality Act, we can all understand it. I think it's much better for employers as well and service providers, because they know exactly what it is.
Yeah. And there's a Single Equality Act in Britain.
Yeah, which has been working pretty well.
It's been working very well. And even despite Brexit and everything else, it's still keeping pace with European directives because of the...
It's just easier, you don't have to start amending all different sorts
so
of things.
You don't, so the spine of what should be done is already there. The fact that Brexit's happened hasn't made no impact. It won't have an impact and shouldn't have an impact on legal obligations for marginalised groups or minorities.
Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just come in on that. I think there's 2 or 3 different things in there, and just to break it down, so the Annex 1 Equality Directives, that obligation to keep pace isn't comprehensive. We've identified it's asymmetric. There are different protections in different directives that provide for different levels of protection.
Even reading the paper, to be honest, I was exhausted.
Yeah, it is complex. We're not pretending it's not.
Yeah.
So that's another argument when we responded to, in 2022, the European Commission, for example, had a consultation on the Race Equality Directive, and as part of our response to that consultation, we identified the fact that wider obligation, or the wider sense of pulling it all together into one cohesive legislation, makes things easier. So that was our recommendation to the EU as well, in terms of how they take forward any changes in this area. Now, we obviously don't have the same influence there as we do in Northern Ireland. Across these different protections, some of them are things that are required because the Court of Justice, the European Union, for example, has issued a judgment in an area.
I can't even pronounce that.
Yeah.
Disability in 3.41.
So that's a requirement that the law that we currently have is interpreted in line with those obligations.
Okay.
So it doesn't necessarily require that there is a change in the law, but because we're no longer part of this wider framework, there might be a sense of, do we have to pay attention to that? To what extent do we have to? And that's required under the Windsor framework as well. So we're just highlighting that as something that needs to be borne in mind. When it comes to the amending the legislation, that's something that has to proactively happen. So we're also making recommendations that in relation to the Pay Transparency Directive and equality bodies.
Sorry to cut in, Claire. So if we can't get agreement by June 2026, what happens?
So this is a requirement under the withdrawal agreement. So it's an obligation on the UK government. So if there's no agreement here, there are other avenues. When we were an EU member state, the UK government did step in on occasion where there wasn't agreement in Northern Ireland in order to give effect to EU obligations. It would depend on whether they're prepared to do that, and if not, then there are other mechanisms under the withdrawal agreement that we can use. For example, the Human Rights Commission and the Equality Hub Commission can raise issues with the Specialised Committee, which is one of the oversight bodies for the Windsor Framework, and that Specialised Committee can make recommendations to the Joint Committee, who can make decisions, etc. So there are structures within the withdrawal agreement itself if we can't find a solution locally to these issues.
But ultimately it will be a breach.
Yes.
If it isn't achieved, yeah.
I mean, there's breaches in human rights legislation here. It's a fact of life. It's happened for a long time. But in terms of, you know, what we have here in terms of Section 75 is okay. And that's all it is. It points out that you shouldn't discriminate against. But in terms of making sure that everybody's rights are protected as best possible, I think we just need a single Equality Act for everyone, because it would not only tidy everything up, but it would make it crystal clear in law.
If you don't mind me saying, that's a really good way of putting it, because what it is saying is that equality in and of itself has its own rewards, and it has to be provided for, and everybody is within that. Different times of your life, different reasons.
Chair, thank
Thank
you.
you. Claire, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation this afternoon. Others have touched on it already, and just I suppose to follow up in terms of what Carol has said. Look, in the absence of a single equality bill or act, I've written to yourselves and I've signalled my intention to take forward age discrimination legislation in terms of goods, facilities, and services. I suppose one of the areas that I feel there will be not necessarily agreement on will be the starting age of that legislation. It's, you know, I think in the past, and there has been a lot of work done in this area, most people agree on the legislation in itself. However, I understand there was contention around whether that was to extend to all ages or whether it was to begin from 18, as is in the Equality Act in England and Wales, or if we could even take it down to 16. So I'm keen to hear your views on that. And I'm sure I'll engage with you more as I take forward this bill.
We were having this discussion earlier. It's fascinating, but I'm not sure there is a right answer that's going to be very satisfactory today, because it is going to depend on balancing interest. It's going to depend on evolving capacity, and it's not you simply reach the age of 18, then you're an adult, and anything under 18 you're a child. But under 18 you do need special protection in some situations, and we allow for that. So you aren't a rights holder in the same way that I might be, and we have to recognise that. But at what stage do you essentially come and be able to exercise your own choice over the choice of, for example, parents, which is often where people come from when they're looking at this. And I think it does depend on evolving capacity. There isn't a bit like one of the answers I gave earlier. Some of it will be merit-based, so based on really on a case-by-case assessment. So you're going to end up having, I suspect, a ceiling rather than a floor rather than a ceiling. You can't. I don't think you can legislate for every situation, or even a particular age. Although you're going to have to you're going to have to decide on an age.
Yeah.
That's a very good answer, but it's the best I've got. Do you want to? No.
Okay. Well, when I go out to consultation, I expect I'll get a range of.
There's going to be a range of views, yeah. And when you plump for something, we can certainly carry out an analysis and look at balancing situation. But it's very difficult to give an answer. I don't think it's as easy as I know. Some people, some of our colleagues even would say there is a very simple answer to this, but I'm not sure. We think that's correct.
Okay, and you talked around parental rights, and I suppose from a human rights perspective, I would be interested in that, because certainly chatting with others, they feel, particularly in this area, because it's goods, facilities, and services, that some of the concerns around the loss of parental rights, because you have age discrimination legislation, perhaps are unfounded. So, do you have a view on it from a human rights perspective around that, and if we were to extend this to all ages, for example?
You mean would a parent have a right to forbid a child from purchasing something or accessing a service, even if the child would have a right otherwise to access it? Is that?
I think, to be honest, I'm not clear on the arguments around it. I just know that when this particular issue was discussed in the past, there was concerns around parental rights if this legislation was extended to all ages, which is probably one of the reasons why it didn't go forward at the time. So, does the Human Rights Commission have a view on that? Do you feel that parental rights would be affected if, if this law came into place, which protected, people's rights because of their age?
I think I'd have to admit that parental rights would be affected, but it's whether in what way. It could be affected in a very positive way. Some
Sure.
people may say it's a negative way. So you would. I don't want to give a glib answer because there's
Okay.
too much. I think there's too much involved there, and a lot
Okay.
of parents will have very different views. And I think there's probably a range of views even in the courts as to
Okay.
what the answer to that is. But it will depend partly on the age of the child, on the capacity of the child, and
Sure.
on the reason for the parent wanting to limit a right which would otherwise be granted.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm just conscious that we have positive discrimination in terms of age in other areas, and it's not necessarily that I suppose I'm concerned about. It's more around parental rights and all that, but I'm sure we can get into it in more detail. I was just interested.
Maybe one example which there's maybe a little bit more helpful would be in relation to RSE, because that's been mentioned recently in a right for a parent to withdraw a child from RSE in a school.
Okay.
A parent does have a right, according to the convention, to have a child educated according to that parent's ethos. But there is a limit to that, in that ethos cannot be used to deny a child's entitlement to education. And just because it's RSE doesn't make it different to geography or maths, for example. So the state does have control over children, what children receive and what they're asked to do. Which can outweigh a parent's right over the child. So it's all just balancing exercise. But in that you look at the way in which you can accommodate both. So a child has a right to be educated, a parent has a right to have a child educated according to their ethos, so long as it doesn't deny the child's right entirely.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's about balance of rights and what we hope to achieve, and the intention of the bill, and how we can ensure then therefore that doesn't limit other people's rights. Because of that. But no, that was my only question. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Before I bring you in, I just have a question myself in direct relation to that, and that was around when they had the 2015 consultation, and yourselves and Nikki had said around, highlighted that discrimination against children under 16 years should be included. How does that sit then with a minor's capacity to enter a contract? Is that where it starts falling apart a wee bit then?
Well, 2015 is before my time.
Okay.
I think, were you there?
Yeah.
I'm going to let David, Colin answer the specifics of that, but I think the thinking and the legal analysis in relation to that, mine is different to that, perhaps, to what was said back in 2015. Okay. The law has developed over centuries to decide what children can and can't do legally. And entering contracts is one thing which came under consideration over the last sort of 10 years, and in particular in relation to 16-year-olds getting tenancies, whether they could have a legal binding tenancy. So there's all sorts of very interesting stuff around that. But children can be discriminated against if it's justified based on their age and a need to protect. So I'm not sure I would agree necessarily with a statement even made by my own commission, but that may... I don't want to hold them to that, so I'll let Colin explain that one.
Yeah, thanks.
I would say we're reflecting recommendations from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. So the specific details of what would be included in a legal provision or in a bill, as there isn't one to advise on, we're somewhat limited in how we can consider those matters. But I mean, in terms of contract law, it would depend on what the contract was for, and what protections were included in relation to the specific service that is being provided there.
The tenancy one, the way they got over it was that they enabled an adult to take out the tenancy on behalf of the child. And there was an agreement between the child and the adult, but the adult was who would be taken to court if necessary. So there are always ways around it. And I think the law has developed to such an extent that a 16 to 18-year-old could enter a contract, as can a 16-year-old who wants to join, wants to get a car, all sorts of ways in which... So I think it's the more difficult stuff nowadays is 16 to 18. It's that group.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Emma, thank you. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks to you all for your presentation and for the written document that you provided us with. It's always, like the annual report's always really helpful to see the recommendations laid out and to see the gaps sort of listed so clearly. I suppose, and I think I've asked you all this question before, Alison, I definitely have asked you this question before regarding this committee, if you had a recommendation, just one simple recommendation to our committee in terms of what progress we could make, what would you swing for?
I would say before you do anything, policy or legislation, you sit down and think what it is you're trying to achieve and whether it advances or doesn't equality and human rights protection, because ultimately that is what the law is for. And I know people have different views about what comprises human rights, but human rights properly understood according to the Convention should be the job of government to protect. So I think that should always be your starting point. So if you start there, and then you can start looking at justifications for restrictions and balancing rights and all the rest of it, but you have to at least start from the basis that what you're doing is providing for protection of rights.
Okay, so everything with a rights-based approach.
It must start that way. And I think thereafter, and if you follow it's almost like a decision-making model in relation to human rights. It's a lot less sort of, it's a lot less subjective maybe than a lot of people think, but there is an element of subjectivity in it. But if you follow the process, you almost always end up with the right answer, which is a legal answer and a compliant answer if you start off meaning to comply. And I think too often what happens is legislation or policy is developed and then it goes to somebody to screen it or human rights proof it to see whether or not it's going to fall foul of the law. But with human rights, the difference with that is that you should be complying whether you're going to get caught out or not, whether you're taken to court or not. So it's government's duty to do that from the outset.
Yeah, so I suppose what you're outlining there was one of the key themes throughout the whole Bill of Rights process in the last mandate, where oftentimes the evidence that we were getting from different minority groups and people who were living with a particular rights deficit was that, had we a Bill of Rights in place and had we that duty on all sort of elements of government, to whether it be creating policy or actually implementing legislation or delivering services, that a lot of the issues that we deal with as MLAs in terms of constituents coming to us making a representation, a lot of those problems would have been alleviated, because had there been a rights-based approach and looking as to how a service could best be delivered, you would be in a situation whereby nobody's rights have been denied, and therefore whatever it is that they couldn't access, they would have had to access. The folks wouldn't have been money saving or whatever else. So I take that.
I think a Bill of Rights is a slightly different thing, but also it's important to say that if a rights-based approach is taken according to what the European Convention requires strictly and what the courts have said, it wouldn't necessarily alleviate all those problems, because the Convention itself doesn't require, for example, a right to a house. There are lots of rights around your home, but it still does not guarantee you a right to a home, which is one of those fundamental rights that a lot of people are surprised isn't part of the Convention. So I don't want to make it sound like it's an easy answer to everything that's going to necessarily address everything. But certainly if you start out on the basis that you have to fulfil and promote and protect rights as set out in the Convention, you're not going to go far wrong. But I don't want you to think that means that there won't be issues. Yeah. There still will be. And the Convention...
I suppose in terms of the constituency work, like there are loads of examples that I can think of, children who haven't received a place, the SEN children who don't get a place in school for the beginning of the school year, or don't get an appropriate place, or the transport that they require, or people requiring domiciliary care packages, or people living with a disability who can't get the respite that they need. All of those things, it always strikes me when we're talking about equality legislation, that right-based approach, if the decision makers were making a decision based on fulfilling the rights of the citizens living in the place, as opposed to meeting a budget or whatever other priorities feature, that you would be alleviating an awful lot of the stresses that we incur. I suppose the other question that I wanted to ask, and you referred there to competing rights. And we can see at the minute there's a bit of a narrative rising around this this idea of competing rights that an awful lot of the time I find very unhelpful. And coming at it with the mindset that rights are universal and that, additional rights for one group doesn't mean less rights for anybody else. I find it interesting around the discourse in terms of the progress made for the Irish language community. So last week, obviously, we had Forrest McGilligan to the committee, and they presented through the medium of Irish, which for anybody that holds Irish language dear was a big step in terms of the Assembly in the North being able to facilitate that, and was massive progress in terms of minority languages and for language rights. And then we see this discourse around, the protection of English. I wonder if you have any comments on that or this notion of competing rights.
Rights can sometimes come up against each other, but I don't think if you approach it properly, they're ever in competition so that one person necessarily loses out. It may be that my right to do one thing is circumscribed because somebody else has a greater right or a more immediate right to do something else, but that's kind of what life is. Sorry to sound corny, but that is all laws like that. You have rights, but there are responsibilities that immediately go with exercise of that right. And I think too often we see it as one right excludes another right, and it doesn't have to at all. You can have right for both English and our speakers.
Okay. That's lovely. Thank you so much. A lot to digest there. Really appreciate your time as ever, and good luck with everything. Thank you very much.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Okay. Take your ease, members, just for a wee minute while we just change the panel there. But just to say that our next oral evidence session will be with YouthAction NI. Your brief, your papers are of the clerk's brief are at page 55. So as you know, we were keen to get a panel this week representing young people. Felt that it's important for the inquiry itself. So really appreciate that at very short notice we've been able to secure. So if you would like to come forward, we'll. So today we have Sean Madden, Senior Youth Worker, YouthAction NI, and Olivia Davidson Miller, Youth Worker as well. So you're very welcome, and really, really appreciate you coming at such short notice.
Thanks, thank you very much for having us. As you have said, it was very short notice. I got a wee phone call on Monday asking did we do it, and I'm sure you'll appreciate that this isn't myself or Olivia's natural environment for us in the youth club or an interface, and you'll see us doing our thing and doing our best work. So we've prepared a wee bit today around sort of what we see the priorities for youth work is to help tackle the inequalities of young people. Myself and Olivia can share some of our resources and some of our work with young people and children and how we help tackle inequalities. What I think we'll do best is if we open up the floor and you ask us for some examples of work, that's where you'll maybe see our passion and our real sort of quality of what we do. So in terms of our organisation, YouthAction has an 80-year history of tackling inequalities facing children and young people regionally. So our top priorities to continue to support children and young people through youth work is ensuring that youth work is an educational right for all young people. The Council for Europe and the European Union in Youth Matters highlights the value of youth work with recommendations to embed across all member states. We see youth work as an educational intervention which improves the lives of young people and communities. It is carried out mostly by volunteers and youth work charities and groups. Without that voluntary buy-in, we would be lost as a sector. Youth work not only improves the lives of young people, but also saves the lives of many young people. Many young people are unable to access life-changing and even life-saving support or even basic support, and that's where we're able to help them access those opportunities. Young people have many learning experiences that create outcomes and skills to make a positive contribution to the economy and society, and I think us as youth workers play a key role in highlighting those positive experiences. Young people build essential skills and, more importantly, build foundational skills for life, communication, leadership and resilience. We think young people build leadership through volunteering, altruistic activities and activism, all supported by training, accreditation and training that we provide. Youth work challenges the disabling factors that affect young people's growth and development and we believe youth work makes a significant contribution to many government priorities, e.g. ending violence against girls and young women, building safer communities and growing a stable economy. Young people need a sense of certainty and stability, and that's what we as youth workers can provide. We can be that power of one. We can help young people go on a journey and become the best version of themselves. In terms of opening it up, is there any sort of questions you guys would have?
Okay.
Make it a wee bit easier for us.
Yeah, no, thank you, and as I really appreciate you've probably been thrown at the deep end. So what we're trying to do is this inquiry, trying to see what we can do to better support all sections of society, and I suppose the young people that you will work with will not just fit into one pigeonhole. You know, there'll be LGBT, ethnic minority, disabilities and stuff, and I just wonder to what degree more could be done to educate them in terms of their rights and also the responsibilities in society, and how they can better voice when they feel that they're being discriminated against. Is there anything that you think in terms of what better support could be put in place for them?
We think that giving young people the opportunity to be involved in the decision-making processes and engaging with them at a younger age is vitally important. A lot of the young people that we would engage with would be 16 plus, and by that stage decisions have been made. They maybe haven't had the opportunities to meet other young people from different communities, different ethnic backgrounds. So we believe that being able to engage with young people at a younger age will help open up their sort of ability and their opportunities to engage, and we think that is the most important aspect of helping them make those decisions and be involved in that process.
And what are the issues that they talk about? You know, with the Youth Assembly, for example, they've done some work in terms of mental health, so obviously that's probably one you will mention, but you know, are there any other issues that the young people you're with are particularly concerned about and they would like to see policy changes?
I would say for a lot of the young people that we work with, and I suppose I'm thinking of particularly young people that I've worked with that come from the care system, they're not really involved in a lot of the decisions that are made that then have impacts on their lives. So I think it's making sure that they're in the room a lot of the times and those conversations are happening. Often they're being told, like by a social worker, you know, these are the two decisions that you have to make. But they should have already been part of that decision making, because I find a lot of the times it's like a this or that, and either way it ends up not being a really positive experience. So for me, an example I have from my own practice is a young woman that I worked with. So she had turned 16, and with that, you know, it changes in the social care system, and her choice was to stay in a home or to be moved to a town that was like 2 hours away from her community. And her community was actually the youth centre that I worked at, and the young women were her friends and her family. But she was that busting to get away from the home, you know, being a young person in care, that she took the choice of moving 2 hours away. And sadly, the result of that was she ended up doing an attempt on her life and ended up in a mental health hospital for a long time. And to be honest, that has been her life ever since. You know, consistently having attempts, just consistently being let down, because now she's like an adult. So a lot of that support has been taken away from her. So I feel like if she had have had a seat at the table, and even if, like myself as her worker, could have been there to advocate with her and say, why would we move this young person so far away? Can we find a solution that allows her to still be able to be part of this community that is now her community? It might have made her life not as chaotic as what it is sadly now. So I think for things like that, I think it's really important that young people are actually listened to and brought into that conversation when those are happening, because they ultimately have to live with the decisions of those conversations.
Thank you. So Sean, you'd said there around youth work is around accessing life-changing and life-saving opportunities and training and stuff. Could you give us some tangible examples of how that's delivered and what the key themes are?
Yes, so we would focus around a number of key themes in YouthAction. So the two that I'll talk to is around employability and peace building. So in terms of it being life-saving, we would have young people sort of presenting themselves to us with basically nowhere to live. So how is that young person meant to actually go out and look for a job or find a job? when you have that at the back of your head. So we're working with young people that have multiple barriers before they can even get on that ladder to try and get sustainable long-term careers or sustainable long-term employment. So we would have young people that would come to us with basically they haven't eaten in days, they've nowhere to live that weekend, they've been kicked out of houses, they're sofa surfing, and that is life-changing. We would be able to bring them around to centres, we would be able to bring them around to get put on housing lists, being put on housing executive lists and stuff as well. So it really is known where to go for to access that help for the young people, and being open and being willing to sort of go above and beyond and help them achieve those sort of support structures and access them.
Thank you, Sean. I'm going to bring in Deputy Chair Stuart.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you, and certainly very interesting background, particularly for the young woman that you were dealing with and her housing and community needs. To what extent do the young people that you engage with think about their rights? Or is it the case that you're always having to explain to them what they may be entitled to and what their rights actually are? And what do you hear young people talk about when it comes to their rights and their equality issues?
I would say a lot of the young people we work with aren't fully aware that they are active citizens in our society. So it's our role as people that work in youth action, but as youth workers out in communities, it is our role to educate young people and making them aware that these are part of communities. And I think a lot of times actually communities don't realise that young people are part of their communities as well. So it's maybe bringing like the wider community into those spaces and places as well. And a lot of times what happens is that young people, there's like a wee light bulb that kind of goes off and they go, oh, I can access that. Oh, that's something that I have that they maybe didn't realise. And I know for me, again, personally, journeys that I've went on, particularly with a group of young women, was, that realisation of others, of realising maybe the journey of what women have done before them and the rights that they've got, such as like the right to vote and things that they're like, that was only 100 years ago, what? And so then it's looking at ways that now, what way, or would they be discriminated in maybe even in 15 years from now, they may be only 14, but you're looking at like the gender pay gap, you're looking at lack of, childcare, things like that. So that's actually the stuff that young women that I'm working with are thinking about, and so I think it's really important that the young women are aware of that, because when they're done with us, youth services, they're out in the world and they're making those decisions on who is the best employer for me, or do I want to have kids, and what does that look like for me if there is no childcare, or why is the male counterpart to the job I'm doing getting paid more? I think it's really good that young people are able to challenge that and stand up for themselves.
Thank you.
Okay, Carol, please.
Thank you for coming to the committee, especially at very short notice. That's what we do on yous. See, in terms of, so for example, a lot of people realise they don't have a right when something's been denied to them. So in terms of preparing young people, particularly the previous panel that was in front, they said that the ages between 16 and 18 was a bit awkward because, like for example, you can join the British Army at 16, but you can't actually get a contract. So unless you've got a social worker or a guardian or something like that for a tenancy. So in terms of yourselves, is there something more that we need to do about explaining what happens here in terms of rights?
I suppose, and I know you do it, it's just giving young people the access. It's about explaining to young people at a younger age as well. There's no point in engaging with a young person at 16 or 17 when they already think, that the whole system is against them. If you bring them in here and the only experience they've had is a negative experience of formal education, or the only time they've ever seen someone sitting in a suit as a social worker who's constantly talked down it.
I'm not talking about bringing them in here. No, what I'm talking about is, for example, how do we help yous, or what is it we need to do in here to help yous to work with children and young people in terms of gaps in equality? Because that's we're doing a committee inquiry at the minute in terms into the gaps in equality legislation. So age discrimination is one thing. You've mentioned the gender pay gap, there's disability, there's race, But I suppose just to help, I suppose better citizenship for children and young people, what would you ask of us that we need to do to help you make that a lot easier?
I suppose it's providing maybe longer term funding that isn't maybe a year or two. It takes a year or two maybe to get your feet on the ground, to get trusted by young people, to build their confidence. So those longer term initiatives that are maybe 4 or 5 years really help you engage, really helps you go in and build long-lasting sustainable relationships in communities. YouthAction is a membership-based organisation, so we have over 180 members regionally, so we do have access to communities and the hardest to engage young people. But if you're only getting in and out and parachuting in and out for 4 or 5 weeks, it maybe isn't as worthwhile as if we knew we had longer-term sustainable funding where we could go in and build those long-term relationships and long-term opportunities for young people where they are at and where they feel comfortable engaging with us.
And see, in terms of the current ending violence against women and girls strategy, have you had any input into that strategy? Have, like, for example, young girls and young women that you work with, are they aware of it or have any involvement in that strategy?
Yes, they currently are at the moment.
Good.
Yeah, there's I think one member of our senior leadership team is on that as well. Again, we kind of do that as just part of our practice when we're working with young women. We have a resource called Bullseye, and we will go through that with young women, because to be honest, that's actually their lives anyway. You know, it may not always be like pure physical violence, but they're still experiencing some sort of violence in their lives. But for a lot of them, it's reality and it's normal.
Coercion and control.
Yeah,
and
they don't even realise that they're in that. So again, like what Sean says, if you have a longer time where you're not just kind of, you know, just running in and running out, you're able to actually build those relationships where young women can actually say, do you know, I actually see what you said to me 3 months ago. I realised I'm now living in that. And I think for me, a lot of the times with funding can be so directed on an aim that is decided by like yourselves, and there's maybe part of it is important for young people, but it's maybe missing another part. So like, could be violence against young women and girls, and we're thinking about coercion, we're thinking about violence, but actually that young woman is mainly thinking about housing, because her abuser is the one that has the contract for the house. So it's how do you actually make sure you're covering all the different angles. And like what Sean said, like funding, obviously, I mean, we work for a charity, you know, we're constantly being hit with less and less money. It's just the reality of what it looks like. But I think lowering the age and things, like you're talking about 16 to 18, you know, if young people are educated at 14, it means when they're deciding to go to a job or deciding to make a big decision at 16, whatever that may look like, could be university, could be whatever, that they're fully informed. A lot of them are kind of like, shit, I'm 16 and I need to make a decision, and what do I do now? But actually, if they're given time at 14, by the time they're 16, it's informed and it's for them and it's meaningful, instead of just that kind of panic, oh, I need to do this kind of thing.
No worries. Okay. Thank you.
Harry, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question was similar to yours, Carol. It was you had mentioned violence against girls, Sean. I was just wondering, I mean, what other methods do you use, you know, to prevent this?
Prevent sort of violence against girls and young women.
How do you?
Again, we would be working with young women, but we'll also do a lot of work with young men as well. So we would have sort of practical resources that our youth workers can pick up and go out and deliver. As I say, we are a membership-based organisation. So one of our youth or community groups on the ground may identify that as an issue for the young people that they're working with. They'll pick up the phone, contact us, and one of our sort of specially trained youth workers will go out and work with that group of young people on the ground. So whilst we may not be out there before, but their youth worker is able to identify that as a key issue, and sort of we're able to pick up the resources that we've developed and go out and work with young people to try and challenge.
And you feel that's making a difference?
Yes, definitely 100% is making a difference, yeah.
Because we're aware that like toxic masculinity and all of that exists, and it's like, again, it's a normal for a lot of young men, so it's our role as youth workers to challenge that quietly in a soft way and go, well, why do you think that, or why do you believe that, and take them on a journey of like just changing their mind and all of that. And I think we have an RSE resource called Turn the Light On, and a really important bit for that for me when I have done that sort of work with young men's groups is in and around consent. Teaching young men about consent, that no is no, and yes can be taken away, and just the realities of what that can look like if you get into difficulty where you haven't listened to somebody saying no. And see, to be honest, it can be awkward, a conversation to have, but it's actually incredible, because young men will go, I didn't know that, or I thought, as soon as somebody says yes, that's it. So I think it's whatever we're educating young women, we also do the same for young men as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
Chair.
thank you. Sinead, thank you.
You've covered quite a wee bit there, but just to take it a wee bit further from Carl's question, how do you think we can increase the capacity of young people to develop their knowledge of their discriminations and the protections around it? What more can be done? You've talked about the ending violence against women and girls. You've talked about RSE and working with the various groups within it. And I see in the correspondence here as well, we've got a letter from the Peace Summit, and you're involved in that, and you've made a response to the Programme for Government and about the prioritisation of peace building and reconciliation. Is there something in and around that that needs more support and more help and given greater prioritisation?
Yes, but
again, it just goes back to providing us as an organisation with the opportunities to engage with the young people. We're really good at doing that, and again, that goes back to funding us for that sort of work, because sometimes that work maybe doesn't sound as overly exciting or as overly needed as other pieces of work, but it really does. I was involved in that Festival of Peace in Dungannon. There was over 85 young people involved from all around the region, from different backgrounds, from different communities, different age groups, and the beauty of that was the intergroup learning, bringing them together to share their own experiences. So I suppose, not to keep going on and harping the same thing, it's just providing organisations who are on the ground working and know what they're doing with the security and the funding and the opportunities to continue to do what they're good at doing.
Yeah. Can I ask, just what age group are you working with?
YouthAction works with, our project works with young people aged 16 to 25, but we do work with young people in their own factor as young as P6, P7.
Right, okay, yeah.
So it's a good wide range. That event in Dungannon did have young people from maybe P7 first year right up to the ages of 25, 26. So it was a lovely section of young people. Obviously, we didn't have the P7s and the 25-year-olds in the same room, but we were able to sort of facilitate the discussions in the same way.
So would you say a lot of your work is around education then? It's, developing the capacity of young people to understand their rights and to understand their place in society?
Yeah, it's definitely around education.
That's embedded in our whole practice. Youth work is education. It's just informally done. And YouthAction and we are rights-based educators. That's what we do. But it's, I suppose for us, it's our bread and butter. It's kind of, we just go in and work with young people, and it's our job just to support young people as best as we can. We can give you loads of different stories of discrimination that happens to young people, but I suppose I'm kind of thinking from a place of you're asking what can you give us, and I think Sean's right. It's more support, be just giving young people spaces to come and be heard, giving us access to resources that can be used, and then, like Sean said, funding. It's just needed. It's just the reality of what we're in, really.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Timothy, please.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks very much for coming along. This afternoon, there's a number of the questions, I suppose, has touched on some of the things that I'd like to explore with you. So you primarily work with 16 to 18-year-olds. Sometimes you work with ones from P6 upwards. At what age would you recommend that we need to start to educate young people? At what age do they become interested? And where do you see the responsibility line. So obviously parents have a responsibility when they're bringing their child up, and they have a right to bring their child up in whatever way they seem fit. Then they go on school. What responsibilities does school have? And where do you see the cracks in that young people maybe aren't aware of their rights? And one of the biggest things is, how do you get young people interested? Because they have to reach a certain age before really they do become interested in that.
No, I think young people are interested in knowing their rights from a young age if we can engage them properly. Like if I'm delivering a training course to young people aged 16, 17, 18, I'm going to do it differently to young people that are maybe primary school or just first year, second year. So I think it's all in how we do it, how we approach it, how we tailor our sessions. But I think young people are open to learning from a young age. So they are, and to give young people credit when you do engage with them at a young age, they're like sponges, they soak everything in, they ask questions, and we're able to sort of help give the best answers that we can and support them and give them as best guidance as we can.
And I also think something that like makes youth work so special is we build relationships with young people, and from that could be a one-to-one or it could be in a group, and how we do that is through providing food for them, doing some games, it could be taking them on a trip, or it could be into those bigger discussions of their rights and all of that. So we take them on that wee journey and we build relationships with them, and that's how we're able then to start educating them on rights. We won't necessarily walk in right away to a group we don't know and be like, right, do you know about your rights? We take time with them, we get to know them, we get to figure out what makes them tick, or what they don't have a clue about at all, and go, well, do you know about this? Do you know about that? And with that, then we work out what they care about, what they don't care about, and what's important to them and not important to them.
And we will use different tools. For example, YouthAction has a performing unit called the Rainbow Factory with over 450 young people from the ages of 8 or 9 engaged. So they work with maybe 225 young people per week, and they use issue-based theatre to help young people sort of explore and look at their rights. We engage with sports teams, sports clubs. So youth work is a tool that uses many different methodologies to engage with young people, to try and find out and let them engage with us as confident and as safely as possible.
What's come across there really strong is that really you get alongside them and do life with them. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah.
On that basis, like, I can be critical of Stormont from time to time, but one of the things they really do well in, excel in, is the education officers that they have in the building, and bringing young people in to try and introduce them to politics, introduce them what happens. I'm certainly a massive advocate of that, because once you get people in and you start to break the ice with them and introduce them to it, then they start to open up and get an interest. So is that something then that essentially you believe should happen, at an early age the conversation should be introduced, whether that be primary school, further education? Is that something you would like to see built in the curriculums? Is that something you would like to see more youth workers on the ground to do? More places where children can go, young people can go?
Yeah, I think so, because then it doesn't seem like the big scary people on the hill making all the decisions. Like, that young people then can feel like they can come here and have their voice heard. And I think even for us as youth workers, we wouldn't feel as terrified as sitting here if we were maybe, in amongst us a wee bit more. Because for us, we're literally in communities day in and day out. We don't do this very often, so it's maybe more terrifying for us than maybe others that you've met today. So yeah, I think it's opening the doors a wee bit more, having those conversations and just being welcoming to children and young people. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Brian, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming in, especially at short notice. You touched earlier, Sean, I think, on special education needs, and I'm on the school board of governors, and I'm interested in your views on whether you're involved in this yourselves, some alternative models, for education for pupils who a traditional class setting is just not providing for their needs, not working for them. Just your views on how you see that working. Are you involved in any models like that? And how to, have you been involved in that? Have you seen progress in terms of people's being able to progress back towards a more normal class setting?
Yeah. Okay. I suppose for me, the group I'm going to talk about is actually a group that has already went through like the educational system, and maybe some other training as well. But when I kind of created this wee group of young people, probably 19 to 24 that have autism, ADHD. Yeah, they're post. Yeah. But what we kind of were able to see was the young people. They got maybe decent education, decent training, but from being able to build friendships, being able to get a bus from A to B, being able to handle their bills and, maybe one day have a home on their own, that was, that young person at 19 was a lot different to another young person that maybe didn't have autism. And 19 would have been is totally different. So we have had to take this wee group of young people on a journey of, they started with us last year. Most of them all just got taxis, because they were scared to get buses or anything. Now most of them are all getting buses in and out on their own, because we took them on that journey. We were like, okay, we'll meet you at the bus stop, we'll get you on the bus, we'll walk you to the place. And now they're able to be a lot more independent because they're able to see that they can be. And one young man, like, he had nothing to do at all, like, God love him, and he's the loveliest young man. And when he talks, he's like, I have friends now. Like, I come here every Wednesday and I have a group of people that I know are my people. And he never had that before because he was maybe just in school and out. And he would be classified by the world a lot difficult. He's not, but that's how he feels he is. And for him, being with us in that wee group is the first time in his life he's been able to be totally himself. Because we just let him be who he is, because that is who he is, and he needs to find peace with that because he's now an adult and he now needs to work out what that looks like for him in the world, So I think, again, because we work with older young people, obviously we know there's issues with education in relation to young people. There are more needs with saying young people. It's out there in the news all the time. And I think there needs to be more done there. I think there needs to be, maybe, is it more skills created or whatever? I don't know. I'm not really the right person for that. But what I think should be done is, I think there maybe should be more partnership with like the wider like youth work sector and maybe those that are specifically saying, because there just seems to be a wee bit of a gap there when it comes to that holistic approach.
What those young people identified was that they get qualifications in school, they got formal qualifications, but after school they had nowhere to go. So after school they were just alone, they were in their bedrooms, they had no sort of relationships, and that suppose is the beauty of youth work. We were able to take a wee step back and not fully concentrate on the formal qualifications, but provide a safe, caring environment for them where they would flourish and come in every week and really have something to look forward to. So again, we have worked in schools, Brian. It's just about finding, and there's no point us getting in and duplicating the work that you're doing, but it's about supporting it and providing aftercare and additional support for the most needy young people. And that young person that Olivia's talking about is very friendly with the president of Kosovo. He had a meeting in our building, and that young person was giving them knuckles and high fives and all not too long ago. And I've never seen a young man smile and appreciate like as much as he done. So yeah, it's about working in partnership, working in collaboration, not duplicating the work, and providing the best experience for young people.
I know the school I'm one of the governors for, and other schools will work with youth providers to try to find models that will work, and for the pupils and help them get the best, from their education.
Sometimes it can be as straightforward as taking the young people out of the school environment and maybe delivering our OCNs or our qualifications in a less formal environment. It may work that a youth worker goes into the schools, but again, each young person's journey is different, and it's about us collaborating and working in partnership as much as we can.
Time, just want to ask one other. Again, maybe it's not the age group you're mainly working with. I wanted to ask about looked after children. I don't know if you're directly involved in that. So And again, we hear that there's a shortage of foster families, and just for the needs of children in those circumstances. I don't know again if that's a line of work that you're involved in, and just the support that's needed. It is just in all the complexity, of young people's lives and family circumstances. And so
I'm sure, and there's probably people that could speak better to that, but what I would say, we do work with young people from that background, and we'll sort of work with them the same way we work with everybody else. Any young person comes to us, we will engage them initially by doing a personal development assessment to see what additional needs they have, to see how we can provide support and guidance for them. And if that flags up, we will try and put sort of stuff in place to overcome those barriers. But to be fair, we probably wouldn't be the best they asked about that. We do engage young people from that background, and we would engage the same way we do with any other young person.
Okay.
Thanks very much for the question.
Okay, thanks, Nick.
Claire, online, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming in to give us your views. I suppose generally it's probably quite difficult for young people, even the general public, sometimes to realise what rights are not being fulfilled, or what they, what they would even advocate for us as legislators. So I suppose really it's about interpreting what's happening to them in real life and every day. So I suppose my question is, what are the young people saying to you that they're frustrated with? Whether, in terms of public services, whether it's the police, their education, access to other services, where, what are you hearing from them that suggests that, what, they're not getting what they should be, they're not being treated right, they're not, being fulfilled in a way that they should be of anyone else any other age?
I suppose the first thing that comes to my mind is access to counselling and mental health services. I know a lot of the feedback I get sometimes for some of the mental health services is very negative. A lot of the times, again, they don't feel like they're part of the conversation, and often they're not being fully listened to. I think sometimes young people feel like they're overlooked and not listened to when they're talking about their emotions and how they're feeling. It's almost like a, "Oh, sure, you're young, you'll be fine," kind of thing. And what we see day in, day out is young people are more anxious now than ever before. They have more mental health problems than ever before. I think it's, a jump off of COVID. Anxiety is massively up, and that ability to connect with others is so much more different now. And I think that things like mental health services, access to counselling, we have a really good resource called Life Maps, where we're trying to build positive mental health in young people to try and counter that the negative that we always see all the time. But it's maybe is it providing something like that to show young people it's not always about having depression or having anxiety. It's let's have a good day. Is it your messaging? Things like that would be really useful. You look at suicide rates, and suicide rates for young men are some of the highest, if not probably one of the highest in Europe. So we actually need to tackle that, front head on, quite honestly. I find it quite frustrating at times constantly going to mental health conferences and seeing the same people there who care about it and nobody else there, and it would be really nice to see some of you guys there at some of those events that we're holding every year for World Mental Health Day, talking about the reality of 6 suicides a week. That is not okay for a country as small as what we are. So that's probably not fully the answer, but I do think there needs to be more backing. I think again we need to listen to young people's experiences of the mental health, their experience of using the services in particular, and finding a way to make those services more young person friendly as well.
So I suppose on the ground, for just some of the other issues that are getting raised is the benefit system, young people not really knowing how to navigate it, having a lack of opportunities for employment. Young people will still talk about digital poverty, and something that YouthAction are really good as we're regional based is rural youth work, and young people from rural communities really finding it hard to access travel and opportunities. I was up in our Fermanagh and a skilling office yesterday, and if it wasn't for our youth worker picking young people up and driving them home, the young people, 8 of them have just completed an OCN level 2 introduction to animation. Like 30 people in the whole region have it, so it's an amazing achievement. But if it wasn't for our youth worker picking them up and bringing them home at night, they couldn't make it into any skilling. So it's about those sort of practical issues that I'm sure all young people and all people are facing on the ground, but yeah, there are issues that come up day us day in and daily.
And also in relation to employment, see the 0-hour contracts and also trial shifts are things that young people are constantly kind of abused in. You know, I was speaking to a young person recently where they did 5 trial shifts and then didn't even get the job at the end of it. So that employer was able to get, and they were long shifts, they were like 6-hour shifts, and they didn't get a single bit of money for it. And that's not a one-off story. Do you know, that happens all the time, and it's because young people don't know their rights. I don't think it would happen to somebody older, because we would be like, hold on a minute, you pay me my money, you know, I've worked for you. So it's things like that I think needs to be highlighted or eradicated. I don't know if we can, but that would be really good, because as young people a lot of times fall into the gaps of those sort of more sinister, like 0-hour contracts and things like that.
Thank you. That was really useful, and any more examples that you can think of, you know, I think pass them on to the committee, because I think you are highlighting where the frustrations are and where they are perhaps being discriminated against, because as you say, they're not getting the same access to services because they don't have that information and they don't know their rights. So, you know, I think it's certainly all linked, and just a comment in relation to what you're doing around your work with young men and boys in relation to the violence against women and girls piece. It's 100%. You know, I'm a big advocate for peer support and for people that they look up to and you know and work with in kind of communicating those messages, because I don't think they're going to listen to government advertisements. I don't think they're going to listen to, you know, people who ultimately that they don't even respect, and I understand that, you know. So I think the work that really needs to happen in changing attitudes is with organisations like yourself. So anything more that you can think of, but 100% I'm asking that, but you know, you need resources and you need support to do that. So you know, I would, you know, put my support behind that as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Emma, please. Thank you. Last one. Go ahead, Emma.
Thanks so much, Chair, and thanks to you both for coming in today. And stop putting yourselves down, because you have the lived experience and are actually working with young people and can give us not the theory but the reality in terms of rights for young people, and I have found your contributions really, really helpful. You touched on it there during the last question and answer around mental health and the rate of anxiety, and I suppose the question I wanted to ask kind of falls in with what Brian had been asking you there around the classroom and sort of traditional education settings. I'm finding more and more constituency queries coming in around, you know, children that are experiencing extreme anxiety, who are not presenting at school, who are struggling, who need CAMS intervention, and there almost seems to be nearly like a postcode lottery, or depending on the particular school that a person's in, the speed at which they can access that and the barriers that they come across in trying to get that help. And I wondered if you'd speak more to that, and what do you think? I know you mentioned COVID there. Are there other factors that you think are at play here, or why is this becoming the pandemic that it is at the minute?
I think part of it is probably also to do with you know, there's a lot more poverty happening. We're having a lot more young people coming in through the doors that are hungry, and like we always say that like youth work is, you know, a cup of tea and a bit of toast and have a wee chat, but actually that's becoming like it's an absolute necessity now. Every session that we run has to involve food. And a lot of the times some of our programme costs actually don't cover that as well. So in and around funding, how do we make sure that that is like included in what we're getting money for? And obviously if you're not getting fed, you know, then that will have an adverse effect on your mental health, because you're going to school absolutely hungry. How are you going to be educated? How are you taking anything in when you're starving? You're not going to. Would you actually really want to go into school and watch your friends eat lunch that you can't get? You know, so I think things like that, addressing what's going on in relation to the poverty situation with families, is probably another really important thing, because I think they all ultimately affect one another, and not all young people will be upfront with that right away, so it's on us then to really build that relationship and actually to observe and go, I noticed that young person ate 7 slices of pizza, and the other person who maybe, you know, mummy and daddy was able to provide it breakfast and lunch only had 2. But then what we will do in that situation is go on, take the rest of that pizza home, or next week buy an extra pizza just for that young person. And then it might end up coming into a conversation of, you know, will you end up maybe giving them £10 to fill their gas, especially if it's a young person in care. They don't know how to do that, so we end up doing things like that where we're literally having to meet the physical needs of the young people that we're working with. And I've done shops, I went and done a full shop for young people, I've done their gas and their electric for young people, and all of that affects, it would affect your mental health when you don't have, you know, the right money or even just the skills to be able to deal with those sort of things. You know, how do you save your money, how do you spend it correctly? I
suppose the 3 things that we would try and ensure each young person when they come to us, and I know we're not a school environment, is we would always try and ensure that their travel is covered, the childcare if needed is covered, and that their lunch or when they're with us is fed. That may be the only meal that they have that day. Going back to the levels of anxiety, I think young people having such an access to being online and social media has a massive part to play. But what I will say is there's a lot of negativity around young people in mainstream media, online as well. And what we do as an organisation, and what other youth work organisations do particularly well, is highlight the good news stories of young people. Because what young people will say to me is, if we're constantly told on the news, or we're constantly told we're this, or we're involved in that at the weekend, they're going to end up doing it. So we want to really highlight the positive stories that young people contribute to society. Like over COVID, young people were the shining lights. So many older people, so many people in the communities could not have got through COVID without young people's interventions, and it's about highlighting those stories and continuing to do. I can't even speak. Sorry, so I've drunk 2 things of water already, and continuing to do so. So yes, there's a lot of negativity online. Young people constantly being told they're doing this wrong, they're doing that wrong. So we're trying to flip that, and let young people see what they're doing well, and really trying to highlight it for the wider society. So they're maybe thinking, do you know what? I can't walk down to the shop and walk past that wee crowd of young people. They're just standing there because there's nowhere else to go.
Yeah. 100%.
Thanks for that. You've touched on a few things. The whole social media thing, like when we're talking about rights, and obviously like rights to freedom of expression and free speech and all of that. Do you think, you know, because I know I've dealt with cases in the past where parents would contact you, and you know, you have bullying situations and people suffering that, and it always strikes me that in the past somebody might have been bullied at school, and whilst that was horrific and in some cases really, really, really damaging, there was almost an element of it being curtailed within, you know, the school setting, whereas now it follows them home and it follows them into their bedroom, and it's not always seen or heard. And the impact of things like Snapchat and Instagram and comparison and all of that on young people. I don't know how much you're getting that, and you know, how people's right to say whatever they want can sometimes really affect other people. And the second thing I suppose I wanted to ask you about was in terms of political participation, and whether or not you're getting feedback from the young people you're involved with around the Voting for 16 campaign, and whether people want to be involved in that, or they have any interest in politics and can see themselves involved there. That's me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. 2 good questions. The first one, 1,000,000%. Young people face the issues online so much more now, and I deliver safeguarding training, and some of the examples that we hear from our members out in the community would frighten you around young people, coercion being used. Young people have maybe shared pictures, and people are threatened with showing their family or their friends those pictures if they don't pick up money or run drugs or do this and that for them. So that's happening in our communities. In terms of the voting for 16, I would say the majority of young people would be wanting to lower the age to the age of 16. What we find is you just need to let young people know how wide politics is. Like if a young person can't get into a job, it's because of politics. It's if they're able to vote at 16, they may be able to make a difference. It's just letting young people see the wide variety of them and having that say of how that can impact our lives. And I think we particularly try and do that as a youth organisation. But yes, I'm 100%. I couldn't agree more about the online and young people having an access to it. It's one of the biggest issues for young people at the minute.
Thanks so much. And just to say again, thanks very much for the work you're doing, and I appreciate you coming today. I found that really helpful, and keep up the good work.
Good point, and Dawn. So thanks again. I really appreciate it. And okay, members, can we take 5 minutes comfort break? And
Probably, do you need to know where the toilet is, Sean? He's drank that much water.
Committee Room 30. Sound. 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 Committee Room 30, Sound. Committee Room 30, Sound. Committee Room 30, Sound.
Okay, thank you, members. So we're just going into our final evidence session, our briefing this afternoon. So in terms of our inquiry into gaps in equality legislation. So members, page 57 of your pack, you'll find the clerk's brief. Page 59, you'll find the raised briefing paper on the equality gaps in UK and ROI legislation. On page 94, you'll find the raised briefing paper, a summary of international human rights standards. So we have Thomas Luff, research officer here at the Assembly. He's back again in person, but we also have Ms. Annabelle Reid online, senior researcher. Are you there? Yeah. Okay.
Hopefully you can hear me.
Oh yes, we can. Thank you, and very welcome to committee today. Thomas or Annabelle, are you going to make some opening remarks, or?
Yeah, Annabelle's going to start, and then we'll both do a wee section.
Perfect. Okay, go ahead, Annabelle. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much, Chair, and the committee for, first of all, having us today. I do apologise. I'm not there in person. I'm actually only up the road, North Belfast, but I'm quarantining in the hope of not spreading the bug any further, which I'm sure you'll appreciate that I don't give you that just before Christmas. But myself and Thomas are going to provide a briefing of a paper prepared for the committee actually back in August for its inquiry into equality gaps. So there has been some movement and new faces in the research team here in the Assembly. So Thomas is our lead researcher for human rights, and I oversee the health, rights and justice portfolio. So we didn't actually write the paper that we're briefing you about today, but we certainly do hope to do justice to the authors, Natasha and Glenda's work. And I'm going to rely on Thomas to figure out which slide I should be on. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes, thank you. Yep.
Okay, so as part of the inquiry, you've heard and read submissions of evidence from various groups across Northern Ireland, such as YouthAction just today. So we're hoping that this briefing is apt in timing as your inquiry is drawn to a close. So much, if not all, of what you're going to hear from us today, what you'll already have heard. So this is really a chance to bring everything together for you and hopefully answer any outstanding questions that you might have. So Thomas is going to take us through equality legislation in Northern Ireland, the role of the Windsor Framework, as well as a comparative analysis of legislation in GB and Ireland. And then I'm going to cover off any key differences when it comes to equality gaps. So I'm going to hand over to Thomas again.
Thanks, Annabelle. Nice to see you all again. And as Annabelle said, we shouldn't really probably be telling you anything new. I'm sure you're all well aware of this stuff, but useful just maybe at the end of the inquiry to wrap some of it up again. So starting with Northern Ireland, as you know, between 1970 and 2006, there's been a series of acts and orders which cover discrimination and equality in a range of areas. On the screen there are the main pieces of equality legislation in Northern Ireland. I won't go through them all, but you can see just from the the titles of them all, they cover a wide range of things, and they're really just a bit of a patchwork, which I think is probably a word that we'll come back to over and over again when we describe the situation here. So as well as as those you've got at the bottom there, Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act, which again I'm sure you're familiar with, but worth just kind of going back over again. And it does two things essentially: requires public bodies to promote equality of opportunity with regard to differences of religion, political opinion, racial group, age, marital status, sexual orientation, gender, disability, and people with and without dependents. And secondly, requires public bodies to promote good relations between different religions, political opinions, racial groups. So all of that taken together is the basic structure of the existing equality law here in Northern Ireland. You'll be aware as well, and from the both the Equality Commission and the Human Rights Commission's briefing earlier of the role of the Windsor Framework, and specifically Article 2 of the Windsor Framework. That requires that the UK government ensure no diminution, so no reduction of rights, safeguards or equality of opportunities as set out in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement following the UK's withdrawal from the EU. It also requires Northern Ireland to keep pace with 6 EU directives listed in Annex 1, which again the Commission touched on earlier. And those directives are all in the area of protection against discrimination. Whilst obviously this is a UK government commitment, it is just worth emphasising that the Assembly cannot legislate in breach of Article 2 of the Windsor Framework. So it's something to be aware of in kind of everything that the Assembly does. And just understanding the importance of that obligation. And then finally, just worth in terms of Northern Ireland, just drawing your attention to some potential future developments here, which I'm sure again you're aware of. So the Department for Communities is leading on executive-wide social inclusion strategies in 4 areas: poverty, disability, gender equality, and sexual orientation. A key early stage of that was an expert advisory panel report in each area. And several of those recommended strengthening existing legislation in those areas. So as you'll be aware, those strategies have been delayed, but we understand the Committee for Communities is pressing for those, and they'll hopefully see them soon. But again, as I'm sure you know, there's no specific mention of equality legislation in the recent draft programme for government either. So just a fairly whistle-stop tour through the legislation in Great Britain and Republic of Ireland. So before 2010, equality law in GB was very similar to the law here. Again, that scattered patchwork of different measures passed over a variety of years and decades. In 2010, Parliament passed the Equality Act, which harmonised and strengthened existing equality law. It also established the Equality and Human Rights Commission, EHRC, which operates in Great Britain. The Equality Act creates 9 what it calls protected characteristics: age, disability, sex, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, marriage or civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, and religion or belief. It bars direct or indirect discrimination against any of those protected characteristics in employment, education, goods, facilities, and services. So that's the kind of basic structure of GB equality law is contained in the Equality Act, which I'm sure you're aware of. Given the new Labour government in Westminster, it's maybe just worth highlighting a couple of their plans that they've set out. So in their manifesto, they committed to strengthening equality legislation on a couple of fronts. So that includes amending the Equality Act by strengthening equal pay rights, maternity and menopause discrimination protections, and sexual harassment law, creating a new Race Equality Act. And there's also a duty in the Equality Act that would require all public bodies to try to reduce socio-economic inequalities. That duty has never come into force in law in England, but the Labour government has said they intend to bring it into force. Worth noting that it has been brought into force in both Wales and in Scotland. So they have taken forward that provision in the Equality Act. They also have said they will bring forward a conversion practices prohibition bill, which would include protections on both the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And then finally, before I hand back to Annabelle, in Ireland, there are the Equal Status Acts of 2000 to 2018 and the Employment Equality Acts of 1998 to 2015. They have 9 protected grounds, which are broadly similar to those in Great Britain. The main difference is that in the Republic of Ireland, being a member of the traveller community is a protected ground, which it isn't in GB. The Act prohibits direct or indirect discrimination on any of those grounds, and they also bar what they call victimisation, which is where a person is discriminated against as a result of asserting their rights, or as acting as a witness for someone else. And they also bar discrimination in housing only against people in receipt of housing or welfare benefit. So essentially you can't refuse to rent out a house to someone who is on housing benefit, or the equivalent in the Republic. And the Employment Equality Acts thereby bar direct and indirect discrimination, harassment, victimisation in employment and tries to enable positive action as well by employers to improve equality. So there's quite a lot in there, but I'm sure you're aware of most of that already, but worth just kind of highlighting those main areas. And then I'll hand over back to Annabelle, and she will run through some of the main differences and the main gaps.
Thank you, Thomas. So the slides that you can hopefully see in front of you.
Yep. Back on. Thank you.
Super. Yeah, okay. So the slides you can hopefully see in front of you are a somewhat simplistic summary of the key equality gaps identified in the paper. Now, it doesn't capture all the necessary nuance and caveats. Those details are in the paper. What we hope it does is provide an overview of what gaps there are and how this compares with Ireland and Great Britain. So as Thomas has outlined, I suppose the single biggest difference is a structural one. So Northern Ireland equality law is like a patchwork quilt, comprising of lots of different pieces of legislation. In Britain, equality legislation is predominantly in a single act, and in the Republic of Ireland, equality law is in 2 acts. The Human Rights Commission, the Equality Commission, and a number of UN committees have been urging Northern Ireland to adopt a single Equality Act for a long time, with the hope of making it more uniform, reliable, and stronger. So a second difference is around intersectional discrimination, which I know we talked about actually earlier in the committee session today. So here in Northern Ireland, discrimination law only permits cases of discrimination on one protected ground. So for example, if you have suffered discrimination as an older man, our existing law does not permit both characteristics, so age and sex, in that example, to be reflected in a legal complaint. In British law, Section 14 of the Equality Act would explicitly allow for this, although I should note actually that section actually hasn't been brought into force yet. Another gap relates to age discrimination. So in Northern Ireland, age discrimination is only illegal when it comes to employment. I know we've talked about this again today. So in Britain and the Republic, age discrimination is prohibited in relation to goods, facilities and services. So that is a very clear and familiar gap. So OFM, DFM, as it was then, consulted on proposals to introduce similar protections here in 2015, but these proposals, they basically fell on a disagreement over who the law should apply to. So everyone over 16s, over 18s, or whatever. And yeah, I'm sure you are aware, and as we heard earlier today, Ms Sugden has mentioned a few times her intention to bring forward a bill on that matter in this mandate. Another significant gap is around the requirement for a comparator for disability discrimination. So this means that to claim discrimination, a person with a disability must show that they were treated less favourably than a comparable person without a disability. So this requirement was reinforced by the Malcolm case in 2008, which narrowed the definition of a comparator to a person without a disability. So this approach, I suppose, emphasises comparing the disabled person's treatment to others rather than focusing on the specific discriminatory impact they experienced. And as a result, it limits the ability of individuals with disabilities to successfully bring claims. I suppose in contrast, the Equality Act in Great Britain addressed this issue by introducing the concept of discrimination arising from disability. So this means that a disabled person can claim discrimination without needing to compare their treatment to someone else, making the process more focused on their unique circumstances and the barriers that they actually face. I suppose just a final point to the slide while we're talking about disability discrimination is there is no recognition of indirect disability discrimination in Northern Ireland law. So for example, a business offering maybe a bonus to employees who don't take any sick leave could be indirect discrimination to a person with a disability. There's definitely a gap and alignment with the broader protections in Great Britain, as well as international human rights, such as the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Thomas, can you move on to the next slide? So I suppose the next set of differences refers to the scope of characteristics that are protected. So as you're aware, we have Section 75 groups, and in Britain and Ireland have their own set of protected characteristics. So in Northern Ireland, individuals have less protections against discrimination and harassment on the ground of colour and nationality than on other racial grounds, namely race, ethnicity or national origins. Britain and Ireland have a more harmonised definition to address these gaps. In Britain, the Equality Act explicitly includes gender reassignment as a protected characteristic, while in Ireland and here, the equality law is less explicit on that front and only specifies gender. And I suppose the final point on these slides covers discrimination in relation to socio-economic status. So there are no protections here. It's proposed for legislative reform in Ireland, and there are some considerations in Wales and Scotland at the moment, but nothing enacted in England. I think we can go on to the final kind of slide, Thomas. So I suppose the final point we want to make is that it's actually not a current, I suppose, difference or gap, but it just looks, I suppose, to the future. So as Thomas mentioned, the current Labour government has got plans to deepen and broaden equality and anti-discrimination legislation. And look, these matters are obviously devolved to us. So if Britain is bringing significant new equality law into force and we don't, those differences and gaps will only grow. So I suppose that's everything that we wanted to highlight from the paper, and we're happy then to kind of take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Thomas and Annabelle. Really appreciate that, and I always love the way you sort of simplify it, so that it's really at this stage of the day. Just want to pick up on a few points. First of all, it's that protected characteristic in the south, in the Republic of Ireland, for the traveller community, and I'm just wondering, is there a Do we feel that here that will be covered by race, or is there any other area that people assume that the traveller community are already protected?
So travellers are protected under the Race Relations Order in Northern Ireland at the moment. I suppose the difference with the situation in the Republic is that it's a sort of protected characteristic in their kind of overall equality legislation. Okay. Again, that's something, if potentially there was more harmonised legislation, it'd be easier to know that was something that was protected. It's probably an example of the kind of slightly, maybe chaotic isn't the right word, but slightly kind of the patchwork that we come back to of those is, and I think you've discussed it a number of times, is people understanding what rights they have and where they can find them. And you might look at Section 75 or some other legislation and see that travellers aren't protected under that specifically, and not realise that they are under the Race Relations Order. So it's knowing where to look sometimes for that.
The other word that jumped out at me in your contribution, Thomas, was in relation to victimisation. And I suppose when you reflect on the session with the youth workers there around, a fear sometimes of people speaking up for themselves, and she mentioned in relation to the trial days for employers. I'm just wondering, is that something that we should be factoring in terms of our thoughts about, empowering people and protecting people speaking up, whether or not they actually have been discriminated against? I'm just wondering how you feel that works in practice elsewhere, or you've picked up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a huge amount of information on that specifically, and again, as Annabelle said, we didn't write this paper, so apologies for maybe not being able to answer all your questions on it. But it's certainly an area that the protections in the Republic of Ireland kind of definitely differ in these jurisdictions, is that they do have that. And as you say, that's an area where people can be worried about coming forward, because they worry that whilst they might have a legitimate case against discrimination, that they will then be discriminated on for bringing that case, or also what the acts there protect are anybody else who acts as a witness for somebody. So it may be that one of my colleagues has been discriminated against, and I act as a witness, and therefore I cannot be discriminated against for being involved in that case, as it were. So it just provides that extra level, I suppose, of protection for people, and that kind of security that they feel more able to come forward with complaints, and without kind of fear of it impacting their career or whatever it might be.
Fully understand that. Just last one for me then, and it's in relation to, you said the Labour government is talking about strengthening and deepening. have they provided any timeline in terms of when they'll be bringing the bills forward, or the consultations, or do you have any understanding of?
I'm not aware of any timelines for some of that work at the moment. Certainly, there are some of the things that they're wanting to do which are already on the statute book. So that socio-economic aspect of thing is already in the Equality Act. It just needs to be enacted. So some of that is could be done fairly quickly. And as we both said, that's already been enacted in Scotland in 2018 and Wales in 2021, so it's already operational there. There have been a number of bills brought forward both by the previous government and private members' bills in terms of conversion therapy or conversion practice prohibitions. So there's kind of some drafting done for those as well. So that may be something that could be done quicker, but they haven't set any specific timelines that we're aware of.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Chair, go ahead.
It's just, Chair, at this time of the day, it's more of a comment than a question.
Perfect.
At one stage, Northern Ireland was perceived to be at the forefront of equality legislation back in the 70s with pieces of legislation like the Fair Employment Act. But perhaps an unfair question, but why have we fallen behind, and why do we have a patchwork rather than that single equality bill?
That's a good question. It's probably one that you all might be able to answer more than I can, to be honest. Yeah. I suspect, there are all sorts of reasons for that. I think as you were kind of discussing earlier, there were some, maybe there were some EU protections in place as well that were kind of,
hiding us from
may have been doing that. But there's also just the way that the laws are devolved around these areas. So Scotland and Wales have different devolution settlements when it comes to kind of equality legislation than here. So who's to say how they may have moved if Westminster hadn't moved like that as well. So I think there's all sorts of kind of complexities around that. And I'm sure, as you all know, there'll be political dimensions to that as well, which isn't for me to comment.
I guess there's probably the same answer as well, the political dimensions. What are the risks of a single equality piece of legislation for Northern
Ireland? I suppose from some of the evidence that I know the committee's heard previously during this would be, that I suppose the speed of how quickly that could be done, and are there things that could be done meantime? For example, the Goods, Facilities and Services age legislation, could that be done more quickly? There's some legislation around race protections which could be brought in more quickly, disability. So maybe concentrating on a single act might be kind of a distraction from that, although both could be done, I suppose, at once. But I think in terms of a single act, probably what we would point out is that it would be important, and I think the kind of research shows this, that it's not just to impose the Equality Act from GB into NI or similar acts, the acts in the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland, and say, well, they have a single Equality Act, we have one now too. That there's, I think stakeholders and the research points to specific things, and just making sure that whatever legislation is in place in Northern Ireland is fit for Northern Ireland, and there are issues with the acts in both those jurisdictions that could be amended.
And just finally, Chair, as an interim step, would there be any value in consolidating the existing legislation which we have? The commissions and the various UN bodies have really made the point that consolidation is important in terms of people being able to understand what their rights are, a harmonious look at those rights and protections, so that it's not so much of a patchwork, and for employers, for public bodies to better and more easily understand, and if they're able to more easily understand, then it's the protections will be better understood by everybody, and that's important in accessing your rights as much as having them, is understanding that they're there and where they are. Thank you.
Okay, Timothy, please.
Thanks very much. A couple of things just to pick up on. Page 7, 1.34, Sexual Orientation Strategy Expert Advisory Panel Report. Says the legislation is fit for purpose and recognises and is reflective of the diversity of genders in Northern Ireland, and that conversion therapy is prohibited. To take the first question, it talks about the diversity of genders. When you were doing your research, does it mention how many genders there is in Northern Ireland?
No, that's not something that's defined in legislation that there is. I think that panel is referring to genders that people would identify as having, but it's not a definition that we've come across.
Does that take into, obviously you have man, woman, but does that take into consideration people now want to identify as animals?
I'm not aware that it would cover that, but yeah, that's not something that the research kind of showed. Or again, this paper, I mean, as I said, it's not. We didn't write this paper, so I can't be sure what all the background was. But it's certainly not something that's come up in terms of what we've looked at.
When I was doing some research and I put in how many genders there are in the Republic, I think it came up with something like 76. And when it has in here the diversity of genders in Northern Ireland, I certainly would like to know how many made-up genders they're taking recognition of or counting in that. The next part, just moving on, and that conversion therapy is prohibited. So when they say that conversion therapy is prohibited, do they cite examples of what's been banned? Page 8. Or as it should be prohibited?
Yeah, I think, yes, it's that it should be prohibited because there's not a prohibition on conversion therapy at the moment.
Yeah. So that it should say is prohibited. So
yeah,
in that case,
that's it. Yeah.
Do they cite what examples they want to see banned?
I don't know if they provide any specific examples, but there has been a number of pieces of research on that. The UK government did do an LGBT study, I think it was 2017, but apologies if that date's wrong, around that, and they did find that conversion therapy was still taking place in the UK. That can range from, thankfully, less in terms of actual kind of physical therapies. That may have been, therapies is probably not the right word, physical kind of practices that may have been seen in the past, but certainly there are people have gone through practices which have been designed to change their sexual orientation or their gender identity.
So the Labour manifesto pledge that they've give to delivering a ban on conversion practices and protecting the freedom for people. Yeah. Do they cite in any of their explanatory notes or in their manifesto of examples of what they want to see banned?
They do have an explanatory note for that. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not sure. But there is as part of the kind of King's Speech background that was published. There is some information on that. There's obviously a line, and I know you were discussing this with the Commission earlier around balancing of rights and ensuring that kind of it's not about stopping necessarily conversations from happening. It's kind of what those how those come about and the coercion that may be behind some of those. But as I say, I don't have that in front of me, so certainly something I can get for you if that's helpful. But it's something that they have published a bit of so far. But there's no draft bill at the moment, so there's nothing.
Page 17, the committee is concerned about reports that conversion therapy is considered a protected religious practice in Northern Ireland. Conversion is a protected religious practice in any country that's Bible believing, and indeed when I get saved, is that classed as conversion? Is that something that they would like to see banned?
Again, it's a matter for them exactly how they would draft that into what is banned. I don't have that in front of me to tell you exactly what it is that they're looking at in terms of prohibiting. But but there will have to be a balance between protecting people from coercive practices and the religious freedoms that people are entitled to as well. So there would have to be a balance in any legislation to make it compliant.
Yeah, and like,
Sorry, can I just let you all know, my colleague Owen Tennyson, he's actually launched a consultation into this in the last week or so, so that might be something that people on this committee might want to consider responding to, so which would be specific to Northern Ireland as opposed to the line of questioning which would be more GB.
I think on the basis he was talking about jailing people for 7 years, and some of the consultations that he has put out, but certainly
please do respond to it.
I'll take time, and I certainly will, both hopefully in writing and in the chamber when it comes. But I'm certainly troubled by the committee is concerned about reports that conversion therapy is considered a protected religious practice in Northern Ireland. That's something that needs to continue. That's something that we have a right. As a Christian, I see that deeply offensive that somebody would be concerned about that. Further down the page, the committee welcomes decriminalisation of abortion in Northern Ireland in October 2019 and the formal commissioning of abortion services. I certainly always find it strange that human rights, those that champion human rights have no problem with ending human rights. I know that's just a general comment indeed for the committee. There's a number of things in that, but I think on that basis I'll pass to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you. Carol, please.
So I don't think conversion therapy is anything to do with religious belief. I think it was practice used on men who defined themselves as gay, and they were given electric shock treatment and they were castrated. So that's what initially happened, and then
nobody's sticking up. I'm certainly not sticking up for that. But
no, I know you're not, but that's my understanding, Timothy. So when I talk about, and the reason I'm saying that, when I talk about conversion therapy, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about anybody's religious or faith, their beliefs. See, whatever they believe, they have a right to believe that, and that's on the record. And then I think in the 1970s and 80s, and certainly throughout the 90s and the noughties, there was a view that that form of conversion therapy was inhumane, so they went more for what would be now called coercion and control, and it was found that that was breaching someone's human rights. So without getting into a whole kind of ding dong, that's my perception. So when we talk about that, that's what we mean, or that's what I mean. I think it would be worth just getting what was in the manifesto in terms of what, or even what is it the King's Speech? What intent of legislation that's coming forward and where it's at. I would like us at some stage or other, and I'm only saying this now, and it's not to be provocative, but I would like us to have a bit of a more detailed discussion on a single equality bill, because I think there's a lot of myth busting around it. We need to just bust a lot of myths, because at the minute everybody keeps referring to what rights we have as being a patchwork and all over the place. Even if it's to bring it all together, to have a debate on it, I think that's what we need to do. So I would respectfully ask for our programme of work, after we look at our gaps in equality, that we start looking at maybe what a single equality bill would look like without prejudice.
Yep.
So
okay, I think if nobody else has indicated, so Thomas and Annabelle, thank you so much for your work coming today. Really appreciate it. If you could send us those slides again, I'm more of a visual learner.
Yeah, of course.
So if you could send those there, and then I'll be able to make wee notes around the outside. But for now, sorry, Brian, you didn't indicate.
No, I hadn't. So
that's okay. Go ahead.
If I've got time,
Yes,
just wanted to ask, just my understanding of 2.3 on page 10. Pardon me. In terms of amendments to the Equality Act 2010, well, one of the questions would be how many amendments have there been since 2010? Because obviously the argument is that brought everything together. in 2010, but there's been then how many other relevant bits of legislation have there been since? But in particularly 2023, there was the Equality Act 2010 amendment regulations, which, let me see, reproduced from domestic law certain interpretive effects of retained EU law. So that was that just in GB? Was that
Article 2?
Was that
Under
across
framework?
the UK then?
So
or sorry, including Northern Ireland?
That specific would, because it's just relating to the Equality Act, was just for GB, but but the Rule Act or Revocation Reform, I believe, was contained legislation from across the UK, but it's not my area of expertise, so I wouldn't like to tell you something that isn't correct. But for the updates for this in this paper, it's just GB because it's only referring to changes to the Equality Act that were necessary under that legislation. But I don't know how many. I'm afraid I don't know how many amendments there have been, but I can certainly find that out if it's useful.
It's just to know how divergent is law in Northern Ireland to what exists in GB. Like in terms of a lot of EU regulations, GB is actually still following a lot of EU regulations. So the divergence between Northern Ireland and Great Britain is not great in many matters, but it's just to know. And I know you've set out tables there, but the actual full state of actual I know there's been different legislations passed, but with the passing of that retained EU law legislation in 2023 in GB, whether that is actually and that law is already retained in Northern Ireland, is that correct? So whether that has actually brought GB closer to the case in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I'm not sure specifically on that point, so I would have to. If you're interested, we can certainly look into that more. I think the point as well is, just as Annabelle mentioned, that if these changes do take place in GB under the new government there, then that may widen some gaps, and also if, as the EU potentially strengthens equality protections amongst its member states, and therefore the Republic of Ireland would have to follow that. Then there's divergence both north south and east west potentially in different ways, but nevertheless divergence there, which is important. Is worth kind of keeping an eye on and being aware of what those changes are. But certainly if that's an area that you're interested in, we could have a wee look at that.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks again. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
all your work.
Good Christmas.
Oh, and you, happy
Too.
Christmas. Thank you. So, members, just to wrap that up then. So, the clerk and his team are going to produce an interim report for our consideration at our meeting on the 15th of January, and then we'll look to see if there's any more evidence sessions needed. But I think we've been very comprehensive. I think the fact that the young people's representatives today, I think we've probably netted quite a bit of it off. So there's quite a lot to go through.
Yes, Chair, there was a suggestion there that members might like to see the Labour Party manifesto and the King's speech if we put them in the pack for the next meeting.
Yeah, and even just, for example, see the UK single equality bill, and an example of the one in the south, because I think it would be like, I just think people think there's a lot of monsters in these. These are literally just 10 things together. So, and see, as unionists, like, you would not want us to have less rights than Britain, I imagine.
Oh, I know, that's right. So, in terms of the interim report, you won't be at the stage then to maybe even reach any conclusions or recommendations? No, we would just
the
maybe
idea
have a
is just
session?
for members to discuss and debate and decide if there's more information you need and there's more people that you want to have before the committee in order to make a decision. And then at a later date we can arrange to if the committee would want to actually discuss recommendations then.
Chair, just in terms of where this is actually going as an inquiry, and we do have to get to the end of that, but maybe the clerk can guide us in respect of this. If it appears to us that the Executive Office is not prepared to or willing or the state of preparedness to bring forward a bill, there is nothing to stop this committee bring forward such a bill, and we could do that as a committee bill.
Absolutely, yeah. I suppose
Can we get some background information on how that process would actually work?
I suppose the report, in terms of the inquiry report, there will be some recommendations that we would go to the executive office in the first instance and stuff.
You need to have a debate. You could give
Yes.
everybody else an opportunity, but I know what you mean.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts before we move on to? No. Okay. Okay. So, members, then the draft forward work programme, you'll find it at page 7 of your table pack. There's some correspondence from the Northern Ireland Housing Executive regarding its role under homelessness duties and appearing before the committee. We've got them coming before us on the 22nd of January. So we'll hopefully hear a wee bit more from them then. The other update would be in terms of Jerry McCann has advised, well, I got a correspondence which they've asked the clerk to share with you, that the private office has confirmed that the First Minister and Deputy First Minister are now meeting with the groups around the memorial. This has been an issue, as you know. Jerry McCann has confirmed that they are meeting with the two First Ministers on the 15th of January in the morning around this, and he's asked if we could possibly take a briefing from him in our meeting that afternoon, just to let us know how that went, if everybody's okay. Yeah. And then I think there's one other piece there, and it's a request from the Peace Summit Partnership to brief committee in terms of inclusive peace plan and our duty to cooperate. So they've been before us before. We can put them on the list as potential witnesses for the new year, or the forward work programme. Any other suggestions or any other thoughts? Go ahead.
On correspondence?
No, I'm not on correspondence yet. Draft forward work programme.
Okay.
And as I said last week, I've asked the clerk to look at the executive officer's duties and responsibilities with a view that if there's any sessions we've missed. Okay, correspondence. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to comment and notice the press release there about the Maritime Museum at Ebrington Square. So just on our visit there, they were pointing out that building. So just to welcome their Minister O'Dowd, it's approved planning permission. So hopefully that will follow through. And I noticed, I'm not sure did we get the press release, but I noticed that they also, maybe it was last week we got about the Pipe Band Championship, All-Ireland Pipe Band Championship is taking place there next July.
Yeah.
So anyway, we've an interest in seeing the square being used.
No, it's good news. Good news indeed. You're right.
I went up to one of those pipe band championships up in Ebrington. It was very good.
Very good. They used to have it here for a few years through the council, and it was excellent in the civil service grounds.
Here in the grounds.
Aye, down in the pavilion there.
Anything else on correspondence?
No.
Okay. Any other business members?
No. Happy
Okay.
Christmas, everybody.
Happy Christmas, everyone.
Happy
and
New Year.
Thank you to the clerk and his team
Thank
for
you, everybody.
hard work. Yes, I really appreciate it.
Thank yous.
See you in the new year.
Thank you.
All the best.
Committee Room 30, sound. 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 Committee Room 30. 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 Sound.